When Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas premiered in October 1993, it did so with surprisingly little fanfare for a film developed by Disney. It was only after the film left theaters that it began a transition from beloved cult movie to cultural phenomenon. The story of how this creepy classic came about is just as interesting as the film itself. Here's the untold truth of The Nightmare Before Christmas. It comes from a poem. Burton originally penned the movie's story as a poem when he was working as an animator for Disney, which he likened to being stuck in a prison. Burton could never adapt to the style preferred by Disney, which became clear to him while working on the 1981 feature The Fox and the Hound, saying, "I couldn't draw those four-legged Disney foxes. Mine look like roadkills." Burton left Disney, but kept in touch with another struggling animator, Henry Selick. Burton shared his haunting poem about a skeletal figure named Jack Skellington with Selick, who showed immediate interest in directing a feature version. Production started in 1991, but not without some trouble. Selick didn't even have a full script in the beginning. All he had was Burton's best wishes and a few of Danny Elfman's songs to go on. Disney got scared. Disney initially considered turning Burton's holiday-themed poem into a TV special or a short film similar to Vincent, a 1982 short film also based on a Burton poem, but it backed out. The success of 1988's Beetlejuice and 1990's Edward Scissorhands gave Burton enough negotiating power to arrange a deal with Disney, and the project was finally greenlit, with Burton acting as the go-between for the studio and his director. But after seeing the first trailer, then Chairman CEO Michael Eisner decided that The Nightmare Before Christmas was just too dark for Disney. The film was sent away from the kids' table to Touchstone Pictures, where Disney kept content they didn't want associated with their child-friendly brand. What's wrong with disembodied legs and children with sewn shut eyes anyhow? Isn't that basically their slogan? Filming took over 3 years. Hailing from before the days of slick CGI, the effort that went into making The Nightmare Before Christmas was intense. The film was shot at 24 frames per second, which meant that the characters had to be repositioned 24 times for every second of film. It took a whole week to create just a single minute of footage, and 8 camera crews worked at once. It wasn't just a case of nudging a figurine slightly either. The characters had to be carefully disassembled and reassembled for every frame, so their facial expressions matched what was happening on screen. The Pumpkin King had more than 400 interchangeable heads alone. Oogie Boogie was trouble. Despite being a burlap sack filled with creepy crawlies, Nightmare's antagonist Oogie Boogie was actually the hardest character to create. His complex demise in the film was particularly tricky to navigate, consisting of 4 shots that each took a full month to make. Not only that, but the metal armature inside the huge figure was so strong that animators had to get behind it and push it into place for each shot. So it's no wonder he's barely in the film.
Well, what have we here? Santa Claus, huh? Ooh, I'm really scared.
Some viewers also felt that Kim Page's portrayal of the villain verged on racist. Selick defended the character, insisting that Page modeled his voice performance on Cab Calloway. This argument is supported by the fact that some lines of dialogue are lifted directly from the 1933 Betty Boop cartoon, The Old Man of the Mountain, starring Calloway.
What you gonna do now?
Gonna do the best I can.
What are you going to do? I'm going to do the best I can.
Composer Danny Elfman has a long history of channeling Calloway as well, as he did in the 1980 film Forbidden Zone.
Well, son, let me tell you, I'm so pleased to meet you. The boys that I've been expecting to greet you.
Best Friends for Never. All of Jack Skellington's songs were composed and sung by Oingo Boingo frontman Danny Elfman himself. That's Nightmare Trivia 101. But Elfman also recorded all the Pumpkin King speaking parts too. While he nailed the singing, Elfman's voice acting just wasn't up to Selick's standards. And in the end, Burton and Selick decided they would have Chris Sarandon re-record the scenes. Elfman took it badly, refusing to score Burton's next film, Ed Wood. Elfman still got his speaking voice in the film, kind of. The world-renowned composer also voiced the clown with the tearaway face and Beryl, the smallest of Oogie Boogie's miniature henchmen.
Whatever you say, Jack.
Creator cameos. In the end, Elfman's voice being in the movie just wasn't enough, and he had the animators create a shrunken version of his head and hide it inside a cello. Tim Burton's severed head was also supposed to appear in the film's finale as a hockey puck, but the projectile was changed to a jack-o'-lantern at the last moment. Rumor has it that Disney deemed the inclusion of their former employee's head a step too far and leaned on Selleck to change it. Doctor in Disguise. The biggest reveal from the unearthed storyboards was a twist ending. When Oogie Boogie's sack starts to unravel, it isn't just worms and spiders that come spilling out. Dr. Finkelstein is in there too.
Yes, Jack Skellington, it's me. Me, the man who created Sally from bits of flesh and scraps of cloth. But she loves you, Jack, you oblivious twit.
A defiant Finkelstein explains he wanted to teach Sally a lesson before declaring his intentions to make a new creation and disappearing through a trapdoor. The Doctor's gross new creation can be seen in the film's finale. Why anyone would choose a wife that looked exactly like themselves is anyone's guess. But those reasons are probably pretty weird. Lost Voices. Like Chris Sarandon, many of the film's voices weren't the creator's original choices. Burton had worked with Vincent Price on 2 productions prior to Nightmare, but their collaboration on Nightmare had to be called off unexpectedly. Price came into the studio to record the voice of Santa, but when the veteran actor was too depressed after losing his wife, they were forced to consider alternatives. James Earl Jones had discussions with Elfman that ended in an angry shouting match. In the end, Ed Ivory, a relative unknown, was entrusted with the part. Patrick Stewart was also brought on to Nightmare early on in its development, recording a film-length adaptation of the poem.
I'm sick of the scaring, the terror, the fright. I'm tired of being something that goes bump in the night.
In the end, it was decided that the opening verses would be better recited by the film Santa, and the Stewart version ended up on the cutting room floor, DVD extras, and the film's official soundtrack. Horror veteran Christopher Lee also read the full-length poem for the film, but was also ultimately cut to his disappointment.
I'm sick of the scaring, the terror, the fright. I'm tired of being something that goes bump in the night.
But as we all know, Lee is no stranger to being stabbed in the back. Skeleton babies. The last that Jack and old Sandy Claus see of each other is when Santa flies out of sight, leaving Halloween Town under a blanket of snow. In an unused epilogue scene, however, Santa reveals that he actually visited his old friend Jack years after their holidays disastrously crossed paths and found him with a handful of musically inclined children by his side.
So, many years later, I thought I'd drop in. And there was old Jack, still looking quite thin, with 4 or 5 skeleton children at hand, playing strange little tunes in their xylophone band.
Those kids actually sound a lot like Oingo Boingo, now that we think about it. There's kind of a sequel and a prequel. In the mid-2000s, Capcom released a video game called Oogie's Revenge, which takes place after the events of the film. Jack gets bored with his life again, Oogie is sewn back together by his trio of henchmen, and the burlap sack decides he wants to be the king of all holidays, not just Halloween. The game ends pretty much identically to the film, with Oogie once again defeated and Jack once again rededicated to his true calling of Halloween. No one said it was a great story, but there's a video game prequel also. The Pumpkin King, released at the same time as the sequel, actually explains the huge gaps in the film's continuity. The conflict and jealousy between Jack and Oogie is explored, as well as exactly why Oogie has to live underground in his lair. Spoiler alert, it's because, once again, he lost a fight with Jack. Jack's cameos. Burton has declared he'll never create a real The Nightmare Before Christmas sequel, especially not one where Jack goes to Arbor Day Town or something.
Excuse me, is this Hanukkah Town?
No, it's the Vatican, and I'm Pope Slum.
But that didn't stop Selleck from returning to the character twice. In his 1996 adaptation of Roald Dahl's James and the Giant Peach, the brigade of mutant insects face off against Jack as a pirate, with one even declaring, well,
A skeleton?
the skeletal master of horror does his job pretty well, but that's not even his only cameo. Selleck's 2009 stop-motion film Coraline evokes Nightmare in a number of ways, though those with a keen eye were able to spot a direct reference. As Coraline's mother cracks eggs over a bowl, Jack's grinning skull can be seen inside one of the dripping yolks. It's almost a literal Easter egg, but it's so quick it's easy to miss. Others, not so much.
There's kitsch, there's camp, and then there's whatever is happening here. Even if you're someone who thinks the 1978 Star Wars Holiday Special is delightfully bonkers, you gotta admit that there are a few aspects that are rather nightmarish. Agreed? Before the opening credits, fans are treated to a brief scene in which Han Solo promises to get Chewbacca back home in time for Life Day.
I know your family's waiting. I know it's an important day.
After we're dazzled by the star-studded main title sequence, we get to meet Chewie's whole family, and that's when the dread sets in. Sure, Wookiees are theoretically lovable, but they're just really grating here. Suddenly, there's a huge room full of roaring Wookiees, each with a different vocal pitch and continually moaning for several minutes straight. Is this not super annoying to you? The craziest part? Their conversations aren't translated for the audience. There are no subtitles whatsoever. It's a welcome relief when Chewie's rambunctious son Lumpy settles down to watch some hologram acrobats do their thing. But even after this bizarre spectacle, you find yourself wondering, what on earth am I watching? What are they going on about? Why are the dancers wearing sparkle bikinis? It's very unsettling stuff on the best of days. It's also really aggravating. Throughout the special, it's insanely obvious that the young Star Wars stars aren't too thrilled to be appearing in this special. Harrison Ford sounds particularly bored.
That's it, I'm turning back.
Meanwhile, Mark Hamill, caked in what appears to be several pounds of TV makeup, evidently has no idea where he is or what he's supposed to be doing. At least he looks like he might actually be receiving transmissions from space.
What's up? It's Chewbacca.
And Carrie Fisher, an actress who never shied away from discussing her prolific drug use during this phase of her career, is clearly, well, let's just say she's coping with the production as best she can.
Mala, it's so good to see you. Happy Life Day.
Harvey Korman was a comedy treasure. He was a staple of the 60s and 70s pop culture landscape, thanks in no small part to his brilliant work on The Carol Burnett Show and in classic Mel Brooks films like Blazing Saddles. His persnickety screen persona and impeccable comedic timing made for so many unforgettable moments. Unfortunately, none of these moments can be found anywhere in the Star Wars Holiday Special. In fact, Korman pops up not once, not twice, but on 3 different occasions, and playing 3 different characters, all of which we'll get to in a hot minute. Let's start with the first one. Gormanda is a television chef, and Chewie's wife Mala clearly loves her cooking show. She watches Gormanda intently as she prepares the family's Life Day dinner.
Of course, if your family has a hearty appetite, I would suggest then that old popular holiday favorite, the Bantha Rump.
Gormanda is evidently the science fiction equivalent of Julia Child. It's a premise that's not without comedic potential, but there's just something about the frenzied, manic energy that we find deeply unnerving.
Stir, whip, 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 stir. Stir, whip, stir.
Sorry, Gormanda, you and your 4 spider-like arms seem to mean well, but you're just a bit much for our delicate sensibilities. No disrespect to the late Diane Carroll, but exactly how did this cameo come about? Perhaps she thought a Star Wars special sounded like a plum gig, and she certainly did the best she could with what she was given. It's just that what she was given, well, there's really no way to put it delicately. As you can see, and you can never unsee, she depicts the holographic object of unbridled Wookiee lust. Is it getting hot in here? Chewie's father, nickname of Itchy, is enjoying what's called a mind evaporator. This handy gadget is perhaps responsible for the Star Wars Holiday Special's most uncomfortable moment. The Wookiee's family friend Sean, played by Honeymooner star Art Carney of all people, gives Itchy a very special Life Day gift.
Kind of hard to explain. It's a, wow. You know what I mean?
It takes a while for her to come into focus, but suddenly, there she is, the legendary Diane Carroll, playing some sort of intergalactic disco nymph, much to the delight of the dirty old Wookiee.
Oh, yes. I can feel my creation. I'm getting your message.
Yeah, we're getting all the messages. After her coyly seductive introduction, she launches into a performance of the song This Minute. It's a perfectly lovely tune, if perhaps very, 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 very long. And Itchy makes the whole thing feel, well, itchy. The way he grunts and the way those rancid gums flap excitedly, it's all a bit much.
We can have a good time, can't we?
And in case you think any of this is accidental, we should mention that the shooting script specifically indicates that Sean presents his gift as if he is giving Itchy the most X-rated piece of literature in the galaxy. Much like Gourmanda, the second character played by Harvey Korman is also part of an instructional video. Drone Boyd is a not-so-plucky robot who appears on screen to teach a certain Lumpy, hi Lumpy, how to assemble a mini-transmitter. So is Drone Boyd's scene better or worse than Gourmanda's? Well, it's different. Very, very different. The joke in this sequence, if you want to be generous and call it a joke, is that Drone Boyd has a tendency to break down, slurring his speech and occasionally unable to move. Sometimes he talks very slowly, or stops to adjust various robot parts. That's it. That's the whole thing, and it goes on for several minutes. The worst part? Drone Boyd's appearance occurs about 2/3 of the way through the special, and by that point, you're already starting to get concerned that this thing is never going to end. And then suddenly, you're asked to deal with this kind of material.
Let us work slowly or methodically, because this is a job we're doing well.
In one of the special's many awkward scenes, we find ourselves at the Mos Eisley Cantina, the place where Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi met Han Solo and Chewbacca for the first time. And this is where we eventually meet Krellman, the third and final Harvey Korman character. Before you can say McClunky, he's already making your skin crawl. Krellman is chatting up the unflappable bartender Akmina, played by the inimitable B. Arthur, in what is clearly an ongoing one-sided flirtation. It's played like an old-fashioned comedy routine, with two charming performers and the special's sharpest writing. Akmina's prickly dialogue is genuinely funny, especially with the laser blast precision of B. Arthur's delivery. Unfortunately, none of that can save the scene from the icky feeling of watching a nice guy refuse to take a hint.
Excuse me, I have a customer waiting. I'll be right back.
Come back soon. I'll be waiting.
Look at poor Akmina, bound by professional courtesy to put up with him, if perhaps none too politely. It's all just way too real.
I just came in here for a drink, and I found a lot more.
Krellman,
There's also a bit of a physical ick factor in the way Krellman pours a drink into a hole in the top of his head. Is that a second mouth up there that's just always open? Weird, dude. The good times at the cantina come to an abrupt end following a major buzzkill of an announcement. Oh no, not on Life Day.
Due to increased activity among subversive forces, we are placing a curfew on the entire Tatooine system effective immediately.
That means Akmina has to usher all her loyal patrons out, possibly forever. Getting the alien revelers to leave proves to be a challenge.
Fellas, the party is over!
And so she bursts into a rousing number called Good Night But Not Goodbye. It's a song that would get just about anyone out the door in a jiffy. The whole thing is, of course, deeply silly, but it also turns out to be surprisingly heartfelt. B. Arthur, as always, gives it her all, stridently pleading to a room full of rubber-headed monster masks. Is it just us, or does the whole scene end up rather affecting in the end? Really, it all feels a bit like Casablanca, but with a hammerhead. And what exactly is the relationship between Akmina and this humanoid rat? They're awfully tender with one another. Anyone? Thoughts? Hello? Star Wars has always seemed to rip off some real-world conflicts. Fortunately, the films are so fast-paced, fantastical, and full of space wizards with laser swords, you never get a chance to start dwelling on our real issues here on Earth. But the stakes get a little too real in the Star Wars Holiday Special, especially since it's presumably geared towards undiscerning children. There's the aforementioned scene in which authorities clamp down on so-called subversive activity, and then there's this scene in which a stormtrooper tears apart a young Wookiee's bedroom in search of hidden rebels. Happy holidays! In fact, the Empire has never felt more like a Nazi regime than they do here. The special pays a lot of attention to the domestic lives of civilians. You see them preparing for a joyous holiday celebration, but the festivities occur beneath the looming shadow of encroaching fascism. It's bizarrely heavy-handed stuff for a holiday special, no? As the Star Wars Holiday Special approaches its climax, Chewie arrives home with an intensely bored-looking Han Solo, who basically manages to trip a stormtrooper, to that stormtrooper's death. Like, what just happened here? At last, reunited with his desperately annoying family, Chewbacca begins preparations for Life Day. Apparently, this highly anticipated event involves everyone grabbing whatever orbs happen to be lying around, and then marching slowly and determinedly in their red cloaks towards a large open space. Then they just sort of stand there. Finally, Princess Leia bursts into song, a Life Day carol titled A Day to Celebrate, and it just so happens to be set to the tune of the main Star Wars theme. Oh, the pageantry. This all begs the question, what on earth is Life Day? In the intro to her song, Leia mentions,
"This is the promise of the Tree of Life."
First we ever heard anything about this Tree of Life. Presumably this is a huge trunk in the background, right? Is this tree trunk part of the Tree of Life? We may never know. Then there's a druggy montage of random Star Wars scenes, as everyone stands around, presumably meditating on just how rad Star Wars is. Maybe that's the true meaning of Life Day. Star Wars is rad. The winter of 1978 was only a few months removed from the record-blasting box office run of Star Wars. Many theaters kept the movie playing for well over a year past its May 1977 debut. With The Empire Strikes Back still a year and a half away, the prospect of a Star Wars holiday special was obviously a big deal. Just imagine the thrill of hearing an announcer finally rattle off the names of all your favorite Star Wars characters. And then this happened.
R2-D2 as R2-D2.
That one's a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it? As true adherents of the Force know, R2-D2 was originally performed by the late Kenny Baker, who controlled the droid in both the original and prequel trilogies, and usually from inside the costume. There are conflicting reports as to whether Baker was actually involved in the holiday special. Sometimes he's credited with working on the 1978 spectacle, but it's worth noting that filmmaker Mick Garris lists remote controlling R2-D2 for the holiday special as one of his earliest gigs. Regardless, claiming R2 simply played himself is a bit insulting to the performers involved, and it suggests the droid somehow went sentient for this cheesy variety show. Of course, there's also the distinct possibility that no one wanted to take credit for R2's performance here. The Star Wars franchise is, of course, a monster success, which makes the Star Wars Holiday Special very special indeed. And though the films all have a timeless quality about them, the Holiday Special is very much a product of the 70s. In fact, it looks like your screen has been lightly smeared in Vaseline. But where else can you find R2-D2 existing alongside Jefferson's Starship playing themselves, and also playing one certifiable clunker of a song? The Star Wars Holiday Special is unique, surprising, woefully misguided, and an absolute joy to watch. And yes, it's disturbing. Unless snuggling up to drunken space rats is your idea of a good time. Then again, who are we to judge? Love is love.
I find you adorable. I'll tell you a secret. I find you adorable.
The Santa Claus is one of the most frequently discussed movies in the whole Christmas canon. That's partly because when you look at it closely, some of its details actually seem kind of bizarre, nonsensical, or even downright disturbing. Here are some things kids might not notice about this modern holiday classic. The central conceit of the Santa Claus is that if something bad happens to Santa, the next person who puts on his suit will inherit his title. Of course, the movie works well as a comedy because the person who happens to do that, Scott Calvin, doesn't want to be Santa at all, but is guilted into putting on the suit by his young son Charlie. Inevitably, the magic and spirit of Christmas eventually wins Scott over, but not until after a considerable struggle. That struggle is the heart of the film, but this all raises one unsettling question. What if someone terrible had put on that suit? Scott can be kind of a jerk, but he's still a pretty decent person. What if a hardened criminal had gotten their hands on the suit and put it on, say, as a disguise? What if they'd ignored or never even seen the reindeer? What if someone who killed Santa intentionally rather than accidentally fell subject to the clause? Honestly, it's a very poorly thought out system. Troubling contractual issues aside, Scott does put on the suit and manages to bumble his way through delivering a few gifts with Charlie before the reindeer take them back to the North Pole. Once there, he's greeted by absolutely nothing. The reindeer simply run away to their stables for the night before an elf shows up and, without saying a word, puts in a code to make the sleigh descend into Santa's headquarters. The rest of the elves then basically ignore their new boss as he hops out of the sleigh and starts asking questions. When head elf Bernard finally does talk to Scott, he seems annoyed that he even has to fill the new guy in. And the rest of the elves appear neither pleased nor concerned to see the new Santa walking around like a deer in headlights. What's even more concerning is that none of the elves seem to care at all that the old Santa just died and vanished into nothingness. Did they really hate their old boss that much? Does this happen all the time so they just don't get attached? Everyone knows the North Pole is supposed to be cold, but geez. Speaking of the old Santa, the film never once stops to address his past life or legacy at the North Pole. We don't know if he was a particularly good or bad Santa. We don't know how long he was on the job. We don't even know how well he got along with the elves. This stuff is obviously brushed over so the film can get on with Scott's story, but the Santa Claus 2 suggests that it's hugely important for Santa to get married and even eventually begin a family. Did the last Santa do those things? If so, what happened to his Mrs. Claus? Is she long dead? Did she retire from the North Pole upon his death? Or was he too new on the job to even contemplate that? These are all things the story ignores in favor of a plot contrivance that allows an ordinary guy to become Santa after the old one is defeated by a slippery rooftop. But something still doesn't add up here. The Santa Claus is a relatively short movie, and it's not until the sequels that you're given a better look at the whole mythology of the North Pole and the people who populate it. What the movies never explain, however, is just where the actual Santa Claus comes from. When Scott returns in the sleigh, Bernard and the other elves don't seem all that surprised that they have to train a new Santa, which suggests this isn't the first time a Father Christmas has died on the job. Nobody explains how long the contract has been around, but it's fair to say that it's probably very, very old, meaning the mantle of Santa Claus has been changing hands for some time. So who actually wrote this contract? How did it become hidden in the fine print of that little card? Who nailed down the technicalities? Does the North Pole have a legal department? Clearly this thing exists because Santa needed to be replaced one time and the elves realized that they had to create a legal precedent for getting a new one. But the exact details as to how this came about are sadly never revealed. Once Scott arrives at the North Pole and finally gets a little explanation from Bernard, the head elf seems to decide to calm him down rather than bombard him with too many details. Which is fair enough, of course. So Bernard sends Scott to his room to get some rest.
Judy will take you to your room, get out of the suit, it needs to be cleaned. And taken in. Then get some sleep. We've got a lot of work to do and only a year in which to do it.
Sleep on it and you'll learn more later seems like a fair attitude to take with a panicked new employee, but Scott actually wakes up in his own bed at home with no memory of how he got there and, more importantly, no further instructions from the North Pole. So like anyone would, he writes it off as a weird dream. But then his body starts to change, proving that his trip to the North Pole really happened. Even then, however, there's still no word from the elves. The first real contact he receives from Bernard is the list in the form of thousands of packages stacked throughout his house. After that, things only get more manic. So much for easing the poor guy in. Scott Calvin initially dismisses his role as the new Santa as nothing more than a weird dream, but he soon finds that ignoring his new role has some physical consequences. He starts to gain weight literally overnight, his facial hair begins to grow at a supernatural rate, and he develops an insatiable appetite for dessert foods. When it all gets bad enough, Scott does what most people would probably do in the same situation. He goes to his doctor. After a thorough checkup, Scott's doctor delivers his patient a healthy dose of, optimism.
Okay, look, so what? You put on a little weight. A little weight? Does this look like a little weight to you? Weight can fluctuate from year to year.
The doctor confirms that he can't find anything medically wrong with Scott, so he basically just tells him to go home, eat less, and dye his hair. Now, this is clearly a busy general practitioner who just wants to calm his patient, but you can't help but wonder why he isn't digging deeper, and why Scott isn't asking him to. If Scott had just offered to shave right there in the office and the doctor watched the hair literally grow back, he'd be sure to take notice. At the very least, he'd get a good research paper out of it. The Santa Claus is a film that hinges on belief, and the central conflict involves Charlie's steadfast belief that not only is Santa Claus real, but that his father has now become Saint Nick himself. This creates tragic issues within Charlie's family, as his mother Laura and stepfather Neil become convinced that Scott is making himself appear to be Santa in order to take Charlie away from them. It also plays the classic Christmas story trope of adults not believing in Santa Claus like children do. Laura and Neil even discuss this while they recall the exact moments they stopped believing in Santa because they didn't get the gifts they asked for.
I was 3, and it was an Oscar Mayer weenie whistle.
Here's the problem though. The audience knows that Santa is real, and that means these families all wake up on Christmas morning to presents that weren't there when everyone went to bed. But how do the parents feel about this? Is there some strange magic spell that convinces them they put them there? Do they simply forget which presents they bought and which ones they didn't? Are they just confused? It doesn't matter that much to the plot, but it would have been nice to get even a throwaway explanation for this, since the film spends so much time dealing with the parents' beliefs. Okay, so in case you've never seen this movie, it's probably worth knowing that some of the elves have jetpacks. These elves are known as the Effective Liberating Flight Squad, or ELFs, and they're first called into service when Santa is arrested at Laura and Neil's house. Now, setting aside the idea that a man who can fit down any chimney somehow can't do anything about prison bars, the movie's Elves with Attitude shtick raises a whole new problem for Santa and his North Pole crew. This is because the elves stage a very flashy and not at all covert extraction of their boss from jail. They tell the cop on duty that they're his worst nightmare, wrap him up in ribbon and shove a donut in his mouth. Then they cut the door off Santa's cell with some kind of high-tensile tinsel and simply steal him away. Now, you've got to hand it to the elves for having the forethought to launch their raid on the one night where the station is manned by just one cop. But that doesn't clear up the other problems, namely that there's now going to be a police report and even probably some surveillance footage depicting a group of apparent children magically ribboning up a cop and abducting a guy dressed like Santa. That's going to make for some very weird team meetings once Christmas is over. Obviously, despite all the weirdness, the Santa Claus has a happy ending. Scott finally accepts his job as the avatar of Christmas joy and flies off to the North Pole, having converted Neil and Laura to his cause and forged a loving, lasting relationship with his son. What the ending doesn't address, however, is what happens to Scott Calvin the human. You know, the guy with a house and a job and presumably a series of public records that include paying taxes, having a driver's license, and owning property. Later films in the franchise confirm that Scott still maintains his civilian identity in some form, as he occasionally arrives in the human world to visit Charlie. But it's never explained how far this goes. He could simply be showing up, introducing himself as Charlie's dad, and then going back home. Weirder still, when Scott first meets Bernard, the head elf tells him he has 11 months to get his affairs in order. Does that mean vanish his former self? Fake his death? Or does Scott Calvin now exist in this weird in-between world in which his identity is maintained only by diligent paperwork managing elves? These are big questions, people. At the very end of the film, Neil tells Charlie he would make a great psychiatrist one day. Charlie, however, decides he's going to walk a different path.
No, I think I'm going to go into the family business.
It's a sweet moment if you disregard the fact that Neil is also his family and Charlie just burned the poor man's whole life's work with that comment. But it's also kind of a weird remark to make in the context of the film's story. Scott became Santa because the last Santa died, and there are no other humans present at the North Pole. Does Charlie mean he's going to move up there and just live among the elves, or does he mean that he's going to wait for his dad to die and then take over his Santa suit? He's just a kid, so he's probably not really thinking this through, but if it's the former, how would his adult life proceed for him? If it's the latter, does he not realize that his dad is going to have to die for him to fulfill his newfound dream? Talk about disturbing implications.
Christmas is a time of comfort, joy, and cocoa by the tree. But if you're in the right kind of mood, it's also a time for killer Santas, demonic elves, and other seasonal frights. If you want to curl up by the fire for a monstrous movie marathon, here are the best and worst films out there for your Yuletide sleigh. Black Christmas is the twisted godmother of holiday horror films. The plot is a familiar one, with a mysterious killer picking off victims in a sorority house around Christmas. But more than 4 decades after its release, this wintry slasher still wins over viewers with its haunting holiday tone. The film features terrifying murder sequences, compelling performances, and one of the most unsettling phone calls in horror movie history, all set against a cozy Christmas backdrop.
Just like having a wart removed.
Oh my God.
Nearly a decade later, director Bob Clark did a complete turnaround with a very different holiday classic, the slightly less violent A Christmas Story. Now that's a double feature.
You'll shoot your eye out! You'll shoot your eye out!
It's no surprise that Black Christmas got the extreme remake treatment, but louder, gorier, and darker doesn't necessarily equal better. Released in 2006, this second incarnation attempted to flesh out exactly what was behind the brutal murders at the sorority house, and while the answer to that mystery is satisfyingly bizarre, it does pull time away from the victims and their stories. Aside from spelling out the killer's origins, the remake attempts to distinguish itself through increasingly disgusting murder sequences. But it's all just soulless violence, with little charm or fun to be found. For all its effort to grow its mythology and serve up twisted kill scenes, the end result is both too much and not enough. There are plenty of Christmas movies that explore the mythology of Santa Claus, each one hoping to add something to the legend. Few films really succeed at this. One exception is Rare Exports, a Finnish film that offers a fascinating, creepy new take on Father Christmas. Perhaps the best thing about the film is the way it plays with the tropes of Christmas movies. There's a struggling family, a boy searching for a reason to believe in magic, and some wonderful supernatural happenings, all twisted into a frightening fantasy tale. It's a film that both celebrates and subverts Christmas, shattering the illusions its characters have about the holiday as the dark truth about Santa Claus is unearthed. For at least one Christmas Eve, you'll be thinking about Saint Nick very differently. You probably don't want to let that guy in your house. Silent Night, Deadly Night is a campy slasher classic with one of the best posters in horror history. But its sequel is mostly a dull retread of the first film and is about as much fun as a lump of coal. Thanks to a flimsy framing device, the movie spends a huge chunk of its runtime on flashbacks. As a result, a whole lot of footage from the first movie is reused. By the time the film gets around to new material, you're bored enough to turn it off. You may as well stick with the original, or press pause on the horror movies and go spend time with your family.
Why would I want to do that?
If you're looking for the creepiest film about a killer Santa, then seek out Christmas Evil. It's the story of a man whose perception of Saint Nick was forever warped by a childhood incident, leaving him feeling responsible for keeping the spirit of Christmas alive himself. That warped vision ultimately makes him want to be Santa, keeping tabs on local children, which, despite Santa's example, is an insanely scary thing to do. It all leads up to a murder spree that plays out in a way that's much less campy than you might expect. Forget the reason for the season, this is just a bona fide horror film, with a desire to truly scare that makes it an underseen gem.
Your name goes in the bad boys and girls book. And I'll bring you something horrible.
Jack Frost is not by traditional standards a good movie. It's the story of a serial killer whose DNA merges with snow after the truck taking him to be executed crashes into some toxic goo. He then takes the form of a sentient, shape-shifting snowman who terrorizes a small town with his crappy visual effects. Despite failing with both critics and audiences, Jack Frost has stuck around since its 1997 release, seemingly blissfully unaware of just how bad it is. Do you want a holiday movie with a bit of spooky flair that won't scar the kids for life? Then watch Gremlins. Joe Dante's classic about a boy and his strange pet Christmas present has been a source of imaginative fun for 30 years. Every 80s kid knows you can't feed a mogwai after midnight, even if Gremlins 2 admits that rule doesn't really make sense.
Oh, wait a minute, what about this? What if they're eating in an airplane and they cross a time zone? I mean, it's always midnight somewhere.
Santa's Sleigh might be a bad movie, but it's hard to watch without having a good time. Famously starring professional wrestler Bill Goldberg, the film goes all in on its premise of a murderous Santa. And this is no mere imitator. This is the real deal Kris Kringle, coming straight out of the depths of hell. Santa's sleigh is pulled by demonic reindeer, and he keeps things brutally on brand, taking out all of his victims in a seasonally appropriate way. This villainous Saint Nicholas isn't just a Santa gone mad, he's a Santa born bad. It's so stupid that it's awesome, but it's still really, really stupid. The internet's favorite Christmas monster has a movie well worth watching. Krampus starts as a story of a dysfunctional family coming together for a tense holiday reunion, with one side being uptight and the other being a little gun crazy. When one of the kids loses the Christmas spirit and shreds his letter to Santa, things quickly take a chilling turn. A blizzard sets in and the power goes out, leaving the family waiting for a visit not from Santa, but rather his dark shadow. Well made and delightfully feisty, Krampus is a creature feature for all seasons, a work of horror comedy that just works on every level. Enough murderous Santas, how about a killer elf? Most of this horror unfolds at a department store, where a group of teenagers and an ex-cop Santa impersonator are spending the night. It turns out they aren't alone, because a strange elf creature is also roaming around raising hell.
They have magical powers. They can't be hurt or killed. They eat anything. They're a perfect soldier.
That sounds like an okay premise, but elves get so much stranger. The Dan Haggerty starring movie is so bad, with a story so bonkers, that it's actually kind of good. What do Santa's little helpers have in common with a secret Nazi plot? It's way more than you'd expect. You'll have to see it to believe it, but you just might wish you hadn't.
Ranging from funny to festive, these holiday favorites are just waiting for you to binge at your leisure. And whenever you get started, it will be the most wonderful time of the year. Here's a look at the best Christmas movies on Netflix. If you're a bit of a Christmas cynic, you could always spike your eggnog and sit down with Bad Santa, a comedy about a man who uses one of the season's most enduring symbols to gain the trust of everyone around him and then rob them blind while also getting blackout drunk. Sure, it might seem a little mean-spirited, but Bad Santa is actually part of a grand tradition of Christmas films, including the beloved classic It's a Wonderful Life, that use misfortune and misery as entry points into discovering the true meaning of the season. In this case, the person who needs to discover it is Willie Soak, played by Billy Bob Thornton, a safecracker who's sick of his life masquerading as a mall Santa. When he meets a naive but good-natured boy named Thurman, Willie finds his life slowly beginning to take on meaning again, whether he really wants it to or not. It's unapologetically foul-mouthed and surprisingly joyous by the end, and features a terrific supporting cast that includes the late John Ritter and Bernie Mac. Plus, if you're having fun with Bad Santa, Netflix can always carry you right over to the sequel, Bad Santa 2. In the years since Love Actually was released, it has divided viewers with the hottest Christmas media debate since Baby It's Cold Outside. Set in the month leading up to Christmas, it has a cast of, well, basically every British actor you've ever heard of, including Alan Rickman, Hugh Grant, Keira Knightley, Liam Neeson, Mr. Bean, Bilbo Baggins, and Rick from The Walking Dead. Thanks to its interweaving stories of love, it's been called the ultimate romantic comedy and embraced as a holiday essential by many, while dismissed as an overwrought mess by others who think it has some pretty dubious ideas about romance. It's a debate we still have every Christmas, but after all that dust settles, we still want to watch it every single year. Some viewers may dismiss A Christmas Prince as another generic royal romantic comedy that the filmmakers just slapped some Christmas decorations on. If you actually sit down and watch it though, you'll find charm, heart, and a story that wrings every little bit of joy out of what it's given to work with. Rose McIver stars as a young reporter eager to catch the eye of her boss by infiltrating the Adlovian monarchy and learning what's keeping the mysterious Prince Richard from claiming his rightful place on the throne. After going undercover as a tutor to the prince's young sister, surprise, she quickly falls in love with Richard, only to find that there are enemies out to stop his coronation on Christmas Eve. It's not the most lavish production you'll ever see, but there's a reason Netflix dropped the sequel this year. Here's hoping it becomes an annual tradition with increasingly ridiculous plots. Santa Buddies is a warm little movie perfect for kids who love cute dogs and holiday cheer. The story revolves around Puppy Paws, the son of Santa's dog Santa Paws, because of course that's his name, who's a bit worn out by Christmas and just wants to be a normal puppy.
Maybe you should be thinking about how important Christmas is to children and puppies all around the world.
Puppy Paws leaves the North Pole and tries to learn how to be a regular puppy from a few who happen to be on Santa's naughty list. What Puppy Paws doesn't know, though, is that the very fate of Christmas hinges on him learning a lesson about the true spirit of the holiday, and he'd better learn it fast before the cold-hearted dog catcher, played by Christopher Lloyd, can ruin everything. In other words, it's the exact plot of Elf, but with an adorable puppy instead of Will Ferrell. Believe it or not, though, it's both adorable and weird enough to be watchable. The only real problem with showing it to your kids is that they might decide a puppy is the one thing they want for Christmas. Get Santa is yet another film that follows a recognizable holiday formula. This time, it's the tale of the young child trying to convince a cynical adult that Santa Claus is real. The twist is that Get Santa takes that premise and mixes it up with a kinder, gentler version of a Guy Ritchie crime comedy, and the results are as strange as they are delightful. Rafe Spall stars as Steve, a former getaway driver fresh out of prison and eager to reconnect with his son Tom. Tom is a bit disinterested, but calls his father for help when he believes he's found Santa inside a shed.
Hello, mate. How are you? How you doing?
Santa's in the garage.
What?
This Santa claims that his sleigh crashed and his reindeer have been scattered, and asks for help only to end up locked in prison instead. With Christmas on the line, it's up to Steve and Tom to find the reindeer, enlist the help of some elves, and get Santa. That is, if Steve can ever find his way to believing in Father Christmas again. It's a wonderfully weird little movie with a new twist on a classic tale, plus a version of the Journey to the North Pole, or Elf City as it's called in the film, you've likely never seen before. If you're after an enduring holiday classic full of musical numbers, gorgeous Technicolor imagery, and the exquisite comic timing of Danny Kaye, then White Christmas is for you.
I want you to have 9 children. And if you only spend 5 minutes a day with each kid, that's 45 minutes, and I'd at least have time to go out and get a massage or something.
Like many holiday films of its time, it doesn't entirely revolve around Christmas, but rather builds to it by telling the story of 4 entertainers who find themselves at an inn in Vermont, only to find that December hasn't brought any snow with it yet. Like the characters, the audience waits virtually the entire film for anything wintry or Christmassy to show up, but when it finally does, it proves to be absolutely worth it. In addition to Kaye's comedic mastery, the film also features Bing Crosby in one of his most famous roles, Rosemary Clooney showing both her acting and singing chops, Vera Ellen's incredible dancing, and some of the most memorable musical numbers you'll ever see. Oh, and there's also a pretty good song in there you might have heard of. This film has lived on in the hearts of Christmas movie fans for more than 60 years, and a single viewing is all it takes to understand why. Netflix isn't just excelling in the fairy tale Princess Christmas rom-com department. They've also branched out into more humble, even somewhat quirky offerings aimed at everyone who enjoys cozy, low-stakes Christmas fare. Enter the holiday calendar, the story of a small-town photographer stuck in a rut, both personally and professionally. Her life seems to be going nowhere until her grandfather gives her an antique advent calendar that once belonged to her late grandmother.
Those are predicting the future.
How much wine have you had tonight?
The calendar will only open its doors on its own, magically, at midnight each night in December, revealing a unique charm that will prove to have some meaning in her life the following day. Through the calendar's magic, Abby thinks she finds love, then realizes there are bigger lessons to be learned from this strange little family artifact. The Christmas calendar, like so many Christmas romantic comedies, is ultimately predictable, but its charm is such that you won't really care if you see the ending coming. Sometimes the most casually enjoyable Christmas movies arrive when you take a tried-and-true romantic comedy formula and just sprinkle a little holly and mistletoe through it all. That's the case with Christmas Wedding Planner. The film follows wedding planner Kelsey as she attempts to plan and execute the perfect holiday wedding. Her biggest problem isn't the venue or the bride, but a private investigator who's threatening to expose the truth about the couple at the heart of the ceremony and wreck the whole wedding.
You expect me to believe that some mysterious person hired you to ruin this wedding?
Well, technically looking at Todd, but ruining the wedding's a potential outcome.
In an effort to keep the PI happy while still delivering the dream wedding she was hired for, Kelsey agrees to join his case and help him get to the bottom of it. Of course, if you know romantic comedies at all, you can probably guess what happens next. After a long day of shopping, this is exactly the kind of light, crowd-pleasing holiday fare to throw on while you're wrapping presents. Dear Santa is one of the best-known and most beloved of the 21st century's large crop of made-for-TV Christmas romances that frequently circulate on Lifetime, Hallmark, and now Netflix. It's a growing subgenre and a steady rotation for many fans, and Dear Santa is a big reason why. Amy Acker plays Crystal, a rich girl who's facing the threat of being cut off by her parents if she doesn't find some sense of direction. When she stumbles upon a letter a little girl wrote to Santa asking for a new wife for her widowed soup kitchen running father, Crystal takes it as a sign that she's meant to be a part of their family. Of course, not all goes according to plan.
I didn't do anything, I just happened to be here.
Netflix's devotion to original programming led to an even bigger holiday movie boom in 2018 than we've seen in previous years. And that may have reached its peak with The Christmas Chronicles, a film that blends a little bit of the Santa Claus, a little bit of found footage, and a whole lot of Kurt Russell into a very enjoyable package. The film follows a pair of children whose family has been devastated by loss as they try to get along together on Christmas Eve. When young Kate believes she spotted Santa in an old family home movie, she persuades her brother Teddy to stay up with her for a stakeout. One thing leads to another, and the siblings find themselves face to face with the real Santa Claus, who's very different than decades of marketing have made him out to be.
No need to wake up early. There won't be any presents. You two are on the naughty list for life.
With little time and a lot of frustration, the trio has no choice but to team up, find Santa's lost belongings, and save Christmas. It's exactly the kind of charming romp you'd expect from the producer of the Harry Potter movies and a director who worked on Frozen and Wreck-It Ralph, only weirder.
A Charlie Brown Christmas has become a bona fide holiday staple. If you're an adult who's watched the show multiple times, there are several details you may have noticed about this seasonal classic that younger viewers likely miss. Let's investigate. Just as Pigpen is perpetually surrounded by dust clouds and Schroeder is almost always next to his piano, Linus is hardly ever seen without his trusty blue blanket. He's got it with him outside in the snow and inside during rehearsals for the Christmas play.
Linus, you've got to get rid of that stupid blanket.
He's quite clearly attached to the thing, perhaps a little too attached.
You think you're so smart with that blanket. What are you gonna do with it when you grow up? Maybe I'll make it into a sport coat.
You can't blame Linus for not wanting to let the blanket go. It appears to be made of 100% pure magic. It gets dragged through the snow all day without getting soggy, and even serves as a remarkably accurate slingshot. Wait, did he just ice skate with his security blanket in his hand? And now, this is happening. Later on, Lucy tries to get him to put down the blanket so that he can dress up like a shepherd for the Christmas play. That's when Linus reveals that the blanket can shapeshift, forming a perfect headdress complete with a band in the middle. Who manufactures this Swiss Army security blanket? We simply must have one. A good chunk of A Charlie Brown Christmas takes place at the local auditorium, where the Peanuts gang is getting ready to put on a Christmas play. Charlie Brown is roped into the production after he tells Lucy about his holiday depression, and she feels the play will help him get into the holiday spirit.
You want me to be the director of the Christmas play? Sure, Charlie Brown. We need a director. You need involvement.
Charlie Brown eagerly leaps into his role as director, but he can't seem to get anyone to listen to him. Perhaps more importantly, no one seems entirely clear on what play they're even putting on. At one point, Lucy hands out scripts to various kids for roles like innkeeper and shepherd. Obviously, this suggests a nativity play, but then she also asks Snoopy,
"Can you be a sheep? How about a cow? How about a penguin?"
Quite the menagerie all told. To complicate matters further, Schroeder keeps trying to score the play with upbeat jazz, and at one point, Lucy suggests herself for a plum-sounding role.
What about the Christmas Queen,
So is this some sort of highly conceptual, staunchly avant-garde nativity play? Is it a variety show? Does anyone really know? To our ears, it all sounds a tad bit unfocused. A Charlie Brown Christmas begins by focusing on the titular character's own lack of satisfaction with the holiday. He tells Linus in no uncertain terms,
"Christmas is coming, but I'm not happy. I don't feel the way I'm supposed to feel."
He also repeatedly complains that the holiday has grown too commercial. His Scrooginess reaches dizzying new heights when he sees Snoopy putting up a bunch of decorations on his doghouse. That's when he realizes the Beagle is decking the halls for a Christmas light contest that's promising a cash prize.
Oh no! My own dog gone commercial. I can't stand it. Oh!
By the end of the special, we learn that Snoopy not only entered the contest, but managed to win first place. We admit that Snoopy's decorated doghouse looks very charming, but we have a few concerns. He puts lights up all around the roof, hangs a theoretically festive chain or two, and even tops it all off with a star. There's nothing wrong with his decorations per se, but it ultimately amounts to little more than a strand of lights and a couple of baubles hanging around a doghouse. How did this doghouse win out over all those suburban properties? Come to think of it, Charlie Brown's neighbors don't appear to have put in much of an effort. Where's everyone's Christmas lights? Apart from the ultra-commercial Christmas tree lot, it looks like people just weren't feeling it that year. Maybe Charlie Brown had every reason to be depressed. When the Christmas play rehearsals don't seem to be working, Charlie Brown makes a passionate plea.
"Look, Charlie Brown, what do you want?" "The proper mood. We need a Christmas tree."
Lucy agrees and advises Charlie Brown to get a great big aluminum Christmas tree. Charlie Brown and Linus subsequently head to the tree lot, where they ultimately decide to take the scrawny real tree that remains one of the most famous parts of the show. The whole point of the scene is that Charlie Brown picks this little twig of a tree which mirrors his own feelings about the season. But when you look around at the rest of the lot, you may have some questions. It's arranged like a traditional Christmas tree lot, but it soon becomes clear that the tiny tree is the only real tree there. The rest are made of aluminum.
This really brings Christmas close to a person. Fantastic.
Setting aside the lack of real trees for a moment, let's ask the obvious question. Who's selling aluminum Christmas trees outside where it's clearly been snowing? Snow is wet, and the trees are made of a delicate metal. Surely that would have messed up the merchandise, no? When Charlie Brown brings the tiny tree back from the lot and presents it to his friends, they call him names and full-on laugh at him. Then Linus makes a stirring speech, passionately quoting scripture in the hopes of emphasizing the true meaning of Christmas. That's when Charlie Brown decides to take the tree home. He thinks he can convince everyone that they were wrong to make fun of the tree, so long as he can get the decorations right. Charlie Brown gives up after the tree nearly breaks in half from the weight of just one ornament, but then the other kids come along to help. Linus wraps his blanket around the base, and the kids use all the decorations from Snoopy's doghouse to fill out the rest of the tree. By the time the kids are done decorating with all the lights and baubles, the tree looks like it's grown about a dozen extra branches and a whole bunch of extra needles. In fact, it looks like a completely different tree. Is it a Christmas-time miracle?
What's going on here?
In the many years since Home Alone's release in 1990, it's become evident that while Kevin McAllister's solo Yuletide adventures are still tremendously fun to watch, there are a lot of things about this film that are a little too bizarre, illogical, or even downright disturbing. If you're a kid watching Home Alone, Kevin's dialogue feels almost aspirational. The things he says to his parents and other family members are the kinds of things we all wished we could say when we were young, but probably never have the nerve to do so. When his mom tells him to leave her room, for example, he responds,
Hang up the phone and make me, why don't you?
and then when she tells him to go upstairs after he shoves his brother Buzz in the kitchen, he shouts back,
Upstairs. I am upstairs, dummy.
Granted, Kevin is in the midst of being punished when he says this, but still, calling your mom a dummy and suffering zero consequences would have felt like a dream for young moviegoers. However, as an adult, it's a little hard to overlook just how rude Kevin is, and how his parents either ignore it or laugh it off. To be fair, most of the other McAllister kids are just as bad, if not worse. So Kevin really doesn't stand out that much in comparison, making the idea of traveling to Paris with so many disrespectful kids sound more like a nightmare than a vacation. Still, considering that Kevin is the protagonist, it's a little weird that he's characterized as being just as unpleasant to be around as the rest of the kids in his family. Even if you put aside the fact that the McAllisters have clearly spent a small fortune decorating every inch of their expensive home for a holiday they're not even going to be home for, have you ever taken a close look at the rest of that house? It's not just the seasonal decorations that make it feel festive. The entire interior design scheme seems to have been planned around the holiday. Just consider the green kitchen counters and red pots and pans, or the red, green, and white patterned wallpaper covering the walls of nearly every room and hallway. And there's also the parents' red bedspread, the framed red flowers on their walls, and the red and green furniture in the living room. The kitchen floor is red, the dining room walls are red, the upstairs walls are green, the living room has a red and white rug on the floor and green curtains framing the windows. Even the telephone is green. From lampshades to bathrobes to prominently placed teapots, it's hard to find a single surface or person in the McAllister house that isn't decked out for the holidays all the time. After living in such a festive home year-round, it's no wonder the McAllister children seem to be fresh out of Christmas cheer by the time December arrives. When Kevin shoves Buzz for saying he ate Kevin's entire cheese pizza, Buzz falls into some cups of milk, which spill all over the passports and airline tickets on the kitchen counter. The next morning, during the hubbub to get everyone out of the house and to the airport on time, Kevin's dad Peter mentions that the passports are in the microwave, where he put them in order to dry them off. This microwave plan was probably a bad idea for several reasons. Although passports in 1990 wouldn't have had the radio frequency identification chips contained in modern passports, which would have caused them to burst into flames in the microwave, they still would have had plastic covers which would have melted. The passports also would have contained small amounts of metal in the foil stamping on their covers and the inner security features, which would have caused them to catch fire. Peter's lucky he didn't cause the whole trip to go up in flames. Although at least in that case, Kevin wouldn't have accidentally been left at home by himself. Kevin's mom, Kate, realizes on the plane that she left Kevin behind, and the first thing she does after landing is wrestle a payphone away from a French woman so she can call the police. What follows is a frustrating series of conversations as Kate gets transferred from one department to another and conveys her story over and over to bored officers who seem more interested in preparing for Christmas than in ensuring a child's safety. If you're a kid watching this scene, it's easy to get annoyed at the police, especially at the officer who later goes to the McAllister house, knocks once, and gives up and leaves when no one answers the door. Surely this police department is the height of professional incompetence, right? As it turns out, though, maybe not. When Kate calls, all she says each time is,
Yeah, hi, look, I'm calling from Paris. I have a son who's home alone.
Our phones there are out of order, so I'd like somebody to go over to our house, tell him that we're coming home to get him.
She never mentions Kevin's age or the fact that he's not supposed to be alone. Instead, she comes across as an overprotective parent who purposely left her teenager at home and now wants the police to make sure he isn't throwing a rager while she's away. No wonder the police didn't bother investigating further when Kevin didn't answer the door. It can seem illogical that Kevin never calls the police until the end of the movie, choosing instead to construct an elaborate series of booby traps to protect himself. But by Kevin's logic, it actually makes sense. He thinks he made his family disappear by magic, and when he later encounters the wet bandits, he recognizes Harry as the police officer who visited his house earlier. Police can't help with a magically disappearing family, and they may in fact be the bad guys if Harry is one of them. But it's less clear why the pizza guy doesn't call 911 after he delivers a pie to the McAllister home and Kevin uses the Angels with Filthy Souls video to trick him into believing someone is trying to kill him. The ruse clearly works, but then nothing happens. If he's under the impression that one of his customers just tried to kill him, you'd think he'd call the police, or at least report it to his manager, who could pass the incident along to the authorities. But it appears that instead he just keeps it to himself and goes about the rest of his day. During the break-in extravaganza at the end of the film, Kevin knows to be ready because the wet bandits inadvertently tell him to expect them at 9 o'clock. But when he sets up his elaborate fake party, all he knows is that two creepy guys in a van were hanging around outside his house earlier in the day. He had no way of knowing what time they'd be coming back, or if they were even planning on returning at all. Yet somehow he managed to be enthusiastically dancing at the precise moment when Harry and Marv drove by that night. Either Kevin was incredibly lucky with his timing, or he'd already been partying for hours with his cardboard friends by the time the Wet Bandits finally returned. The most plausible explanation is that he had the whole party set up ready to go as soon as their van turned onto a street, kept a close watch, and it was a lot less complicated than it appeared for him to put all the cutouts in motion. But it's more fun to imagine that he was just rocking out with his inanimate guests all day. Although the church scene between Kevin and Old Man Marley is heartwarming, it's hard not to notice that it's also a little odd while watching it as an adult. Even if you put aside the fact that Kevin is in a church an hour before the Wet Bandits are due to arrive and he has to run home in order to make his battle plan work in time, there are still a few elements about the scene that are kinda strange when you examine them closely. It makes sense that Old Man Marley would come over to introduce himself to Kevin and tell him that he doesn't need to be afraid of him. After all, it would have been hard for him to miss his young neighbor fleeing from him in terror earlier in the movie. However, it's a little bizarre that Marley then proceeds to unload all of his troubles with his estranged son onto a second grader he's only just met and whose parents are nowhere in sight. Of course, we understand that Marley means well, especially when it comes to Kevin's rescue at the end of the film, but typically adults don't have impromptu heart-to-hearts with unaccompanied minors they don't know. Of the many traps Kevin sets for the Wet Bandits, one that could have proved disastrous is the electric charcoal starter that he hangs from the front doorknob. The idea behind it is simple, even if the physics are a little advanced for a second grader. Kevin plugs in the starter inside the house, hangs it on the indoor metal knob, which conducts the heat to the outdoor knob and ultimately sears an impression of itself onto an unsuspecting Harry's hand. After Harry gives up on the front entrance, Kevin leaves the starter plugged in and hanging on the door. Keeping in mind that it had already been on the door for about an hour before Harry showed up, that starter was probably left unattended for at least a couple of hours before Kevin turned it off. In that time, there would have been a serious risk of the door and subsequently the entire house catching fire.
It's pretty cool that you didn't burn the place down.
The traps that Kevin sets for the Wet Bandits at the end of the movie all seem like delightfully funny pranks when you're a kid. But as an adult, it's easy to see the many ways it could have resulted in death. Both criminals take some serious blows to their heads and the rest of their bodies during the home invasion sequence, any one of which could have proved lethal. First, there's the iron dropped on Marv's face via the laundry chute, which falls 3 stories to hit him squarely in the forehead. That's enough for severe facial trauma and bone fractures. Then there are the paint cans both bandits take to the face, which could have taken their heads right off. And let's not forget the crowbar that Marv used to whack Harry in the chest, which could have broken his ribs, punctured his lungs, or pierced his heart. And that's not even taking into account all the other injuries both men likely suffered as a result of Kevin's less lethal traps. Somehow, we doubt that the McAllisters' VCRs and jewelry were worth all of that.
You guys give up, or you're thirsty for more?
While it's understandable why the police don't seem to take Kevin's plight too seriously earlier in the movie, it's a little less easy to follow their process at the end. After receiving Kevin's call that the Murphys' house is being robbed, the police arrive to discover Harry and Marv significantly worse for wear, presumably still being watched over by Old Man Marley and his shovel. Harry and Marv are arrested, and Kevin watches from the window of his house, where he then goes to bed and peacefully awaits Christmas morning. Why don't the police ever question Kevin? They must have wondered why the Wet Bandits were so beaten up and in such a weird way, what with the feathers and burn wounds on Harry and the iron-shaped impression on Marv's face. Even if Marley attempted to take responsibility for it, the bandits were fully conscious when the police showed up, and they would likely have been grumbling about the kid that did this to them. It's bizarre that no one ever comes to get Kevin's side of the story and in the process realize that he's home by himself. If the police were better at their jobs, Kevin's mom probably would have arrived home to an empty house and the message that her son was at the police station. Sure, it would have taken away from the moving family reunion at the end, but it would have helped with everyone's peace of mind.
A Christmas Carol adaptations range from the delightful to the derivative. Just how do the many iterations of Dickens' classic tale of redemption stack up? From the total disasters to the heartfelt classics.
Humbug.
Here are A Christmas Carol adaptations ranked from worst to best. Have you ever thought to yourself that A Christmas Carol could use some slapstick animal gags to undercut all the Victorian gloom? How about a sleeker, younger Ebenezer Scrooge who's given a second chance at love? Perhaps a love song performed by Kate Winslet? No? Well, that's too bad, because 2001's Christmas Carol the movie is stuffing all that and more into 81 minutes of tooth-gritted cheer. It's not just that stuff that makes this take on Dickens so skippable. Despite the A-list talent, Christmas Carol the movie is remarkably lifeless. The facial animation doesn't ever look quite right. The acting is, at best, stiff, and the entire operation feels dumbed down. This adaptation's fatal flaw is that it doesn't trust Dickens, and it doesn't trust its audience. This 2003 TV movie attempts to liven up the classic tale by replacing Scrooge with a selfish talk show host and moving the story from Victorian London to modern-day Hollywood. It's an intriguing idea on its own. What setting better represents a story of greed, empathy, and false fronts than Hollywood? And hey, isn't the idea of Scrooge as an image-obsessed celebrity pretty great? In concept, it's all strong and innovative. Too bad the execution isn't. A Carol Christmas is little more than a fresh coat of paint that flakes away over the course of the movie, revealing that it wasn't all that necessary to begin with. The modern setting makes Dickens' story more cloying than anything else. Removed from sooty London, the sickly children and terrifying visions of the future feel more like after-school specials than grave warnings. Worst of all, A Carol Christmas is simply boring. By the end, the audience isn't so much watching the movie as it is waiting it out. The cranky celebrity might learn to be kinder by the end, but the viewer has only learned to distrust new takes on old favorites. There was a sliver of time in the 2000s when movies fell in love with surreal, motion capture-powered computer animation. Robert Zemeckis, fresh from using this technique in The Polar Express and Beowulf, decided to apply it to A Christmas Carol. Led by performances from Jim Carrey as Scrooge and Gary Oldman as Bob Cratchit, the results were odd. Some, like Roger Ebert, hailed it as an exhilarating visual experience. Others, like The Telegraph, considered its looks distracting, creating distance between the characters and the audience that made it difficult to connect to the story.
There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are.
Years later, the movie's reputation remains mixed, and it's not hard to see why. There are certainly strengths to be found. Carrey's Scrooge is a bit goofier than other renditions, but it fits the ghoulishly funny tone of the movie. And Oldman's Cratchit is pitch perfect, but the visuals, so dazzling in 2009, look strange to modern eyes. Plus, the tone of the film sits uncomfortably between two extremes. It's a little too dark to be heartwarming, and a bit too silly to be bleak. Only one thing is truly clear. It's nobody's go-to version when the holiday season rolls around. You might not recognize Alan Menken by name, but there's a good chance you know his work. The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and Tangled all feature his songs. So when he signed on to a brand new adaptation of A Christmas Carol starring Kelsey Grammer, hopes were high. The man behind A Whole New World and Under the Sea tackling one of the greatest holiday stories ever told? That's just not a good idea. It's about as safe a bet as anyone gets in the entertainment industry. And yet, somehow, this version of Scrooge's fateful transformation leaves something to be desired. The music is quite good, though it never hits the highs of Menken's greatest work. The story is solidly told, and the movie features a fine performance from Jane Krakowski as the ghost of Christmas past. Grammer is as grumpy as Scrooge should be, without ever crossing the line into total awfulness. And yet, the entire affair is somehow inert. It never stops feeling like something adapted from the stage that probably should have stayed there. On film, it never offends, but it doesn't impress either. It's trapped between worlds, unable to succeed in either one. Disney has been involved in multiple Christmas Carol adaptations, but this is the one that features the characters most central to the brand. Mickey, Minnie, and of course Scrooge McDuck all star in this particular take on the tale. They bring a certain lightness to even the darkest parts of the iconic story. No one heads into A Christmas Carol thinking Scrooge won't end up changing his ways, but there's still something soothing about Mickey Mouse leading the bleak first half of the story. For the youngest viewers, this is an ideal carol indeed.
Farewell, Ebenezer.
Unfortunately, that's the only group this version is meant for. Anyone beyond the preschool years won't find much to love about this take, blunted as it is by Disney's core characters. This isn't to say it isn't sweet to watch beloved figures like Daisy Duck and Goofy in London, learning the ways of goodwill toward men. The sheer number of A Christmas Carol adaptations, though, means that no viewer has to settle for mere sweetness. Leave this version in the nursery where it belongs, and move on to something better. Unique among Carol adaptations, Scrooge actually features an in-universe staging of the classic Dickens tale. Shrewd TV executive Frank Cross ordered it, and he doesn't care how much strain it puts on his overworked employees. He is, of course, the Scrooge of this story.
Oh my gosh. Does that suck?
He's even got an overworked assistant. a widow named Grace, and an old flame whose work with the homeless contrasts sharply with his creed. 3 ghosts visit him, lessons are learned, and in the end, Frank leads the Carol crew in a rendition of the 1969 classic, Put a Little Love in Your Heart. Spins on Carol can go quite well, and this one does for the most part. Modern mass media suits the protagonist, and it's different enough from the original story to be intriguing, but similar enough to translate smoothly. Bill Murray in the title role plays cross with sharky, calculating menace. He's a Scrooge the audience fears on a primal level, as he's so destructive in a familiar way. But there is a mean-spirited tone to the film, as though the movie is embarrassed to seem too earnest. This pairs oddly with the sentimental ending, which actually goes further down the road to a happy ending than most carols. All in all, it's fun, but only just. This isn't the only animated rendition of A Christmas Carol on our list, but it might just be the most visually striking, so much so that it won an Oscar for Best Animated Short Film. Richard Williams, who masterminded Who Framed Roger Rabbit, directed and produced this version, and the quality is clear in every frame. This version of A Christmas Carol is austere, almost dour, thanks to the crew looking to 19th century engravings for inspiration. As a result, this version might not be the one children respond to. Plus, it's a short piece, only 25 minutes long. You can't help but wish the film had a little more room to breathe, if only to explore the possibilities of its unique animation more. Still, the end result is a gorgeous half hour of pure Dickens, as warm-hearted as it is deliberately rough around the edges. You forget the happy ending within the grimy first half of the tale, so it's all the more delightful to rediscover that in the second. Dickens' work isn't exactly what anyone would describe as feel-good. Sure, A Christmas Carol has a happy ending, but the reader needs to earn it. Dickensian, after all, has become a descriptor unto itself. And this version of A Christmas Carol, aka Scrooge, is truly Dickensian. British giant of the stage and screen, Alistair Sim dons a stovepipe hat in this adaptation, and he cranks up the grumpiness to memorable levels. It's a notably grim take on an already dark tale, but it works for the most part due to Sim's unbeatable screen presence. You hate Scrooge, but you never give up on him. That stirring central performance livens up the whole production, making the film actively entertaining, instead of simply faithful to Dickens. This is a deeply honest Christmas Carol, for better and worse, but it never loses its faith in humanity's ability to change. A version of A Christmas Carol starring Patrick Stewart already has a leg up on the competition. Those who know his work will automatically see him as a natural Scrooge, while those who are new to his work will be quickly convinced. His gruffness suits the character perfectly, while his comedy chops come in handy towards the end. Stewart is an actor at the height of his powers in this adaptation, as natural rolling his eyes at orphans as he is embracing Tiny Tim. He gives the entire production gravity, and he loans every scene and set piece weight and sophistication with his presence. This take on A Christmas Carol helps you understand how Stewart's career has, if anything, only grown with age. The movie around him, in contrast, is merely fine. There's nothing to complain about, but beyond Stewart's powerhouse performance, nothing catches the eye. That's easily forgiven thanks to Stewart, but when placed beside other versions of the story, it's a lot more noticeable. Stewart is talented enough to make the production notable, but in truth, he's the only thing that does. Happily for Dickens and Stewart fans alike, A Christmas Carol is very much Ebenezer Scrooge's story. Thus, this time it's Patrick Stewart's story as well. What the dickens have they done to Scrooge? The tagline of the Scrooge poster pleads. It's also a musical, and one made in 1970 at that. You hear these facts and imagine a sort of perfect anti-Dickens storm approaching. And yet, Scrooge actually ends up being pretty delightful. Yes, it enjoys thumbing its nose at the ideas of the Victorian era and what a literary adaptation should be. But its heart is fixed firmly in the right place, and that results in a truly wonderful rendition of A Christmas Carol. The songs serve the story rather than smothering it, clarifying Dickens' themes as they spin them into an entirely new medium. Is this jauntier than the more classical takes on the story? Yes, but that's a virtue. Scrooge might be making its own rules, but it never loses sight of its source material. There's no shortage of Christmas Carol adaptations featuring top-class talent, especially in the role of Scrooge. But George C. Scott brings something unmatched to this version. A sheer power that pours from every frame. An actor from West Virginia brings something to a role as essentially British as Ebenezer Scrooge that the actual Brits could do well to learn from him. This is a Scrooge who strides, and whose nastiness stings all the more for the force he can put behind it. Thus, it's also a Scrooge who feels entirely transformed by the final credits, and a Scrooge who delivers the moral with renewed energy. He isn't just changed by his ordeal with the ghosts, but rebuilt as a new man with new purpose. Alongside a cast that brings a certain warm quality many Carol adaptations lack, Scott shines all the brighter. It's not just a great take on a classic story, or a collection of impressive performances, it's a holiday treasure all its own. Who'd have thought that a rendition of A Christmas Carol starring Muppets would be one of the best adaptations of all? Unlike the worst offenders on this list, this film doesn't just trot out the morals everyone expects. It also doesn't put any unnecessary new spin on things that don't need changing. Rather, it highlights the best things about the story while providing a new lens with which to view them. Thus, it helps us love them like we did the very first time we heard the story. To start with, there's Michael Caine's Scrooge. He's as grouchy as he should be, but surrounding him with puppets teases out a comical edge. He's a terror, but you're laughing at him from the beginning. This makes the movie an ideal choice for the youngest viewers, but it also gives the film an inventive spin on Dickens' tale. While some on this list succeed by leaning into the story's darker elements, the Muppets succeed by embracing the author's sense of humor, joy, and goodwill. Plus, you will get to see Gonzo, best known for his weird blue nose and love of chickens, play cultural cornerstone Charles Dickens. What's not to love? What makes A Christmas Carol great? There's a satisfaction of seeing a villain confronted with the consequences of his actions. There's a sly sense of humor that peeks out from around the story's most cynical corners. Plus, there's a community spirit that it celebrates. But beyond all that, there's the hope it kindles. A Christmas Carol tells us that it's never too late to be a bigger, better, and more benevolent person.
I shall change my way of living. I will try to keep Christmas all the year.
It's this spirit that the 1938 adaptation embodies. From its first scenes to its sublime ending, it's a beacon of progress in all its forms. Reginald Owen Scrooge is an old monster who finds himself falling in love with life again, flushed with the fact that it isn't too late for him. That this film was made in the midst of the Great Depression for a weary public remains clear. This is a movie for those all too familiar with Scrooge and his ilk, as Dickens' audience was in its day. This version of A Christmas Carol understands the power of its story, like few others, and decades after its debut, it still shines like it did the day of its premiere.
Countless kids grew up with A Christmas Story and have gone from watching it with youthful wonder to seeing it through older, wiser eyes. In celebration of that inevitable shift in perception, here's a look at things only adults notice in A Christmas Story. One of the hallmarks of A Christmas Story is the rich fantasy life that Ralphie indulges in on his road to Christmas Day and hopefully his Red Ryder BB gun. The most elaborate of these fantasies involves him imagining what he might use the gun for as bandits led by Black Bart attack the family home, forcing Ralphie and his trusty new weapon to defend his family. It plays out like the perfect kid fantasy of a Western in their very own neighborhood, but it takes a slightly dark turn when at the end it's pretty clear that Ralphie has killed Black Bart's gang. Kids might not notice this, but the lolling tongues and crossed out eyes suggest death, and he was, after all, shooting them. Yes, it's just a fantasy, but it's a grim one for a kid who mostly just wants to shoot targets in the backyard. Ralphie is 9 years old as most of A Christmas Story unfolds, placing him in a rather interesting in-between age. He's young enough to still consider things like Christmas and Santa Claus the most important parts of his life, and to care deeply about things like Little Orphan Annie's secret decoder rings, but he's also old enough to fancy himself more mature than his younger brother. It's subtle, but this budding maturity comes out in a couple of key moments when it becomes clear that Ralphie is becoming interested in women. When the old man sets up the leg lamp for the first time, Ralphie basically cops a feel of the thing, and in both his fantasies and in real life, it's clear that he, at the very least, wants his teacher to like him. He might even have a little crush on Miss Shields. Ralphie's quest for his Red Ryder BB gun culminates when, feeling all of the adults in his life have forsaken him, he decides to appeal directly to Santa at the local department store on Christmas Eve. This backfires spectacularly, as Ralphie spends the entire time waiting in line trying to focus on his goal, only to forget everything he was going to say when he finally climbs the towering North Pole structure. To make matters worse, the Santa at the top seems unusually intimidating and even frightening to Ralphie's eyes, as he panics amid a closing store and a group of pushy elves. It's clear that Ralphie blew his shot, but what's less clear is why. What about his past history with Santa made him so nervous about asking for something from the big guy? Was he just psyched out by all of the rejections that came before, or is it more specific? A Christmas Story is a tale of kid concerns and kid perceptions, so everything in Ralphie's world is just a little bit heightened. This includes his encounters with the bully Scut Farkus, who seems to lurk around every corner and takes his sick delight in the pain of other kids to near supervillain levels, at least until Ralphie finally finds it within himself to fight back. To any kid watching, bullying is, if not a reality, at least a familiar abstract concept they've had to deal with in their lives, so they may simply accept it and move on with the story. For adults, though, there's a sense that the bullying in A Christmas Story is particularly dark in part because the adults surrounding the children don't really do that much about it, and the kids don't necessarily want them to. Farkas haunts Ralphie and his friends all the time, but they don't tell on him. Flick walks into class with a black eye one day and Miss Shields pays little attention to it. Even when Ralphie finally beats the hell out of Farkas, his mother ignores the other kid in the fight and focuses only on her son, never really stopping to ask what happens. It calls to mind a world in which kids are entirely on their own, and to modern audiences that can be a little scary. Ralphie's father, only ever referred to as the Old Man, is a typical representation of a Midwestern father figure in the early 20th century. He's stern but not cruel, caring but not affectionate, and distant but not absent. He's a man's man, and he spends most of the film just trying to read his newspaper and enjoy a little bit of turkey while his sons get into trouble around him. If you look close enough, though, there are little hints of eccentricity in the old man's life. He insists on being timed when he changes a tire, for example, and went through the trouble of burying his major award in the backyard and supposedly playing taps in tribute to it as he did. He even takes some time in the department store to skip along with the Wizard of Oz characters. Ralphie doesn't think much about it, but there's more to his old man than newspapers and furnace battles. He has a rich inner life that we only see glimpses of. Despite being a ubiquitous movie, there are still things about A Christmas Story that some viewers can't agree on. A key point of contention comes midway through when the old man's beloved major award is broken, and he's unable to glue it back together. The mother readily admits to breaking the leg lamp, but claims it was an accident that happened while she was watering plants. Some viewers believe her, while others think that she did it deliberately because she was sick of looking at the thing. And indeed, she does confirm she thinks it's
the ugliest lamp I have ever seen in my entire life!
So what really happened? Look at the expression on her face just as she heads into the front room with her watering can, knowing she will be alone with the lamp for a moment, and listen to the sheer force of the breaking sound. She definitely meant to do it. These days we think of Christmas as a season that begins roughly at the end of Thanksgiving, a period of weeks packed with decorations, shopping, seasonal programming, and all manner of parties and other events. The way Ralphie obsesses over Christmas in the film, you'd think that it would be similar for him, but in the 1940-ish era in which the film takes place, that's just not the case. For the Parker family, Christmas as an observable holiday really only lasts a couple of days. They go and get the Christmas tree. Then Christmas Eve arrives shortly thereafter, and the family packs in a parade, shopping, decorating, and visits to Santa all in one night. There is no Black Friday, no long period of shipping gifts to the front door, no early December Christmas parades, and no long slog of Christmas parties to march through on the way to the big day. The Parkers basically wait until Christmas as a day to arrive, and then celebrate. It's not a huge plot point, and kids might not notice it, but adults whose entire schedules are thrown out of whack in December definitely do. The leg lamp in A Christmas Story has become so iconic that it's almost more famous than any of the film's actual human characters, but until it arrives at the Parkers' residence, it could be anything. The old man comes home from work one day, says he's going to be getting a major award that very night, and then a crate shows up.
Fragile! It must be Italian.
Well, I think that says fragile, honey.
Oh, yeah.
Before it does, though, the old man is just musing aloud about what the award might be, and even dares to think that someone might be sending him the deed to his very own bowling alley. This raises a couple of questions. What does the old man do for a living, and what on earth did he do to earn a major award that could range from a weird novelty lamp all the way to a piece of commercial property? We don't learn much about the old man's work, and the fluidity of this moment and what exactly might have happened just further underlines a common kid truth. They often don't really know what their parents do all day. When the hard Midwest winter comes in A Christmas Story, Ralphie's mother bundles up Randy in such a way that Ralphie even compares it to deep-sea diving, and Randy famously complains that he's wearing so many layers that he can't put his arms down. Once outside, Randy can't even get up off the ground by himself because his movement is so hampered. It's comical, but it also makes you think of what exactly was supposed to happen when he got to school. Randy couldn't very well pull all of that stuff off by himself, so who was doing it for him? More importantly, who was rebundling him when it was time to go home for the day? Somewhere in that school, there's a poor employee who had to be on Randy Parker winter wear duty day after day, and they very likely weren't happy about it. The old man in A Christmas Story has many different nemesis. There's the furnace that won't stop acting up in the basement, the Oldsmobile that won't run right, and of course the dogs next door. We know very little about the Bumpus family in the house beside the Parkers. All we really know is that they have a lot of dogs, and those dogs really hate the old man in an almost pathological way. They follow him from his car to his door, try to push their way into the house, and ultimately devour the family's turkey when the door's left open just enough for them to get through and wreak havoc. Dogs will be dogs, of course, but the film doesn't tell us what else is going on that allows this to happen. Why hasn't the old man marched over and had it out with Mr. Bumpus? Of course, the plot answer is so he still has to do battle with the dogs, but it's hard not to wonder how things got this bad in the first place. A Christmas Story is a film that depends in many ways upon seeing the world from Ralphie's point of view, which means that our perspective on the various other members of the family is slightly skewed and emphasizes Ralphie's father more than his mother. Frequent rewatching of the film reveals, especially to an adult audience, that Mrs. Parker is in fact a much bigger part of Ralphie's emotional memory than we give her credit for. Yes, she's there for him after his fight with Farkas, but she's also a tender presence in other ways. She leads the silly Christmas carols in the car, has an innate understanding of how Randy's mind works, proves she has the most patience of anyone in the family when it counts, and even reveals a moment of real tenderness with her husband in the film's final scene. Mrs. Parker is much more than a put-upon wife and mother within this story. She has in many ways an inner life that's just as rich as her husband's. One of the most famous scenes in A Christmas Story is the moment when Ralphie makes a mistake and utters the curse, which the movie renders as, "Oh, fudge." This moment and the resulting fallout is mostly about Ralphie getting punished for cursing in the first place, and then blaming it on his friend, something a lot of kids have no doubt done. But while the kids are busy relating to the punishment phase of that story, the adults are probably paying a little more attention to the way Ralphie's mother reacts. A Christmas Story is a PG movie, so we don't hear too many curses thrown around, but Ralphie makes a point of telling the audience that he's heard that particular bad word frequently from his father, something Schwartz's mother even guesses over the phone. We as an audience also hear Mr. Parker's nonsensical cursing wafting up from the furnace throughout the film, so we can guess at what else he might say in other situations. Why then does Mrs. Parker seem to have no clue as to the kind of words her husband might use in a high-stress moment? Whatever's going on there, this family has an unhealthy relationship with profanity, and they need to all get on the same page.
A Christmas eye patch and an attic full of Easter eggs. Come and wrap these hidden details in A Christmas Story Christmas. We triple dog dare you. In A Christmas Story, Ralphie thinks a way to get his parents to grant his wish of getting a Daisy Red Ryder BB gun is by writing an A+ essay about why it's the perfect gift. While he thinks his writing is strong, Ralphie also knows a bribe won't hurt. So while other kids get their teacher an apple, he gets her a fruit basket. In the new movie, A Christmas Story Christmas, Ralphie is a struggling novelist. In his meeting with the publisher, he gives the publisher some candy that he admits is a bribe in his internal monologue. As was the case back then, the bribe doesn't work, and the bribe just goes in a drawer. In A Christmas Story, Ralphie has a lot of dreams about the future. In one of his dreams, his paper is such a success that his teacher raves about it, and his classmates loft him on their shoulders as a great hero. In another fantasy, Ralphie sees a future where he goes blind, because his mom punishes him by forcing him to put soap in his mouth. In A Christmas Story Christmas, Ralph sees a future where he wins a major literary award to the chagrin of the publisher who rejected him. He also sees a future where his Christmas Eve arrest turns his daughter into a teen mom and his son into a member of the Sex Pistols. Then there's the Black Bart dream. In the original movie, young Ralphie saves everybody with his BB gun, and Black Bart threatens to come back. In the new movie, Ralph takes on a Clint Eastwood vibe. This time around, however, Ralph can't save his family and ultimately falls in battle. As an optimistic child, he's a hero. As a struggling grown-up, he fails. In A Christmas Story, Ralphie describes his father as so.
Some men are Baptists, others Catholics. My father was an Oldsmobile man.
In A Christmas Story Christmas, Ralph drives an old Plymouth. Even more, his car is pretty beat up while his dad had seen himself as a member of the pit crew in the Indy 500. While there are some similarities, the differences seem to be more prevalent. There's a scene where Ralph goes to buy a tree, attempting to emulate his dad's ability to negotiate the best price. Instead of getting a great deal, he accidentally buys the monster tree that the lot couldn't sell. Even more, while his dad is a model of 1940s middle-class success, Ralph is a struggling writer whose wife is supporting the family. Though that's actually a sign of progress from the world of housewives and working men the original movie inhabits. One thing stays the same though, Ralph is as devoted to his kids as his dad was. In A Christmas Story Christmas, Ralph has a daydream remembering all the perfect Christmases his dad presided over. They're basically a series of images of the family presented in Norman Rockwell-esque illustrations. Most are actually just recreations of Rockwell classics. The montage is fleeting but important, as it brings to mind the idea of living up to the old American Christmas dream. It also harkens to the look of the original poster. The poster for A Christmas Story was illustrated by Robert Tannenbaum, yet looked like one of Norman Rockwell's classic depictions of Americana. The 2012 sequel, A Christmas Story 2, also had a Rockwellian poster. It is appropriate that a movie set during the heyday of the Greatest Generation adopted a Norman Rockwell aesthetic in its promotions. Even more, it's fitting that Ralph's daunting attempt to encapsulate and recreate these moments was referenced through these classic illustrations. Once you're a parent, people are considerably less interested in what you want for Christmas. Maybe that's because what you want as you get older is often less fun than the hottest new toy. In A Christmas Story, Ralphie's dad says he wants a new furnace for Christmas. Several times we see his dad head to the basement to fight their furnace with a string of expletives and the sound of clanging echoing throughout the house. In A Christmas Story Christmas, Ralph starts off by asking for his dream gift, a time machine to go back to the beginning of the year when he and his wife had agreed he could have a year to pursue his writing career full-time. Then he mentions the more realistic gift, a new radiator for his car. We see his car's constant radiator issues, which he fixes with an egg. So maybe Ralph and his dad are more alike than they thought, seeing as they both come to understand that the practical things in life sometimes take precedence to less grounded hopes and dreams. Merry Christmas? In A Christmas Story Christmas, Ralph returns to his childhood home for a Christmas unlike any other, seeing as it will be his first Christmas without his dad. The home looks the same, sure, but it's in the attic where we find the real treasures. Ralph goes up to the attic looking for the Christmas ornaments, but is thrown back into his old childhood while digging through his parents' junk. There are tons of nods to the first movie up there. He opens one box and finds a pink bunny costume, a gift from his Aunt Clara.
He looks like a deranged Easter bunny.
And he casually tosses aside the shade to his father's bizarre leg lamp, as a strain of sultry lounge music plays for a brief second. He also gets infuriated when he finds a plastic Christmas tree his mother had bought, and decides the first thing to do is to go get a real Christmas tree. There is some irony in the fact that his father had said he was thinking of maybe buying a plastic tree. Of course, his dad only said this as a negotiating tactic to get the Christmas tree salesman to throw in a piece of rope and tie the tree onto the family's Oldsmobile. Ho Min is a fictitious Midwestern city, a mill town it would seem, set up to represent any town, USA. The central part of Ho Min is of course a great department store downtown, known as Higbee's. In A Christmas Story, Ralphie describes reveling at the Higbee's window, and in A Christmas Story Christmas, he's still just as impressed. When they go into Higbee's, the elves have the same costume, a setup as a slide down from Santa, to the point that Ralph warns his children about getting a boot in the face.
Ho, ho, ho!
And Santa is still a distraction for the kids while their parents shop. There's even a creepy kid in front of the children in line who pukes when it's finally his turn to talk to Santa. There are differences though. Mom and Grandma sit in the lounge drinking while Dad does all the shopping. Julie is a shrewd negotiator with Santa, unlike her father. And this time around, we get to see the mad dash of pre-internet gift shopping that today is relegated to Gen X and older nostalgia. There are few more memorable lines from any Christmas movie than
Y'all shoot Uriah! Y'all shoot Uriah!
In A Christmas Story, Ralphie's mom says it, his teacher says it, even Santa says it to him. This simple but famous line was what everyone told him about why he shouldn't get a BB gun. And sure enough, the first time he shoots the rifle, a BB ricochets into his glasses. Since his glasses saved him though, there are no eye injuries in his family. That is until he pegs his daughter with a snowball in A Christmas Story Christmas. In A Christmas Story Christmas, the scene that most cements Ralph's role as a good dad is not the gift hunting or the desire to make them stronger or deliver the perfect Christmas. We see him launch into an unabashedly joyous snowball fight with his kids as his car cools down, and we instantly realize how much he loves his family. All is going well until Ralph turns to launch a distant snowball at his son Mark, and inadvertently hits his daughter Julie in the eye at point-blank range. As a result, Judy ends up with an eye patch. The inclusion of a grown Flicken Schwartz in A Christmas Story Christmas was a highlight for anybody who grew up with the movie and wondered whatever happened to their own childhood friends. Of course, in the original film, you'd maybe only know them as Ralphie's friend who stuck his tongue to a pole, Flick. and the one who triple dog dared him, Schwartz. These days, Flick owns a bar where Schwartz is a barfly. You can't help but feel bad for Flick for the tongue thing, so it's a wonderful moment to see him get his revenge in A Christmas Story Christmas. In the new film, he triple dog dares Schwartz to jump into a snowy field by going down a frozen slide. Schwartz gets his comeuppance, and like all good friends, they follow it with some all-is-forgiven camaraderie. It seems like an odd choice to have Ralphie grow up to be a writer, but in A Christmas Story, he does have a scene of divine inspiration. While writing his essay on why he should get a Daisy Red Ryder BB gun, Ralphie describes the words just flowing out of him into what no doubt would be a magnificent story. In A Christmas Story Christmas, grown-up Ralph goes to the attic, now having failed to get both his book published and his kids' Christmas presents. He describes how the words pour out of him as he writes about his father for what was supposed to be his dad's eulogy. In A Christmas Story, the essay doesn't get the grade or reaction he'd hoped. Yet, in A Christmas Story Christmas, this flow of inspiration yields a story so captivating that it lands on the front page of the local paper. There is a time-honored tradition of children running through the meticulously wrapped gifts they've received. The Parkers are no different. What is fun to see, though, is how similar Mark and Julie are to Ralph and Randy when they were kids. The chaos at his Christmas gift opening was captured perfectly in A Christmas Story, and the echoes in A Christmas Story Christmas hit just as hard. It starts off controlled and respectful, but then it quickly explodes into a chaotic scene of tearing apart wrapping paper. Even more, in A Christmas Story, Ralphie and Randy both open socks at the same time. They look at their boring gifts, then disinterestedly throw the socks over their shoulders and get back into tearing apart wrapping paper. In A Christmas Story Christmas, Mark and Julie get books and throw those over their shoulders before getting back to work. Proving whether we're talking about the 1940s or the 1970s, one thing remains the same. Kids have no problem running through their gifts in search of the ones they actually like. There's a lot to relate to in A Christmas Story, but few parents can deny that possibly the best scene is when Ralphie's mom and dad get to sit in a chair together in the dark, having successfully pulled off yet another Christmas. A Christmas Story Christmas has its own version of the scene, but it's a little different. After all, Ralph's dad is gone. Or is he? Instead of Ralph's mom and dad basking in the glow of the tree after all the chaos of the holiday, it's now Ralph and his mom. Although this time, Ralph and his mom are worried about the future and missing Ralph's father. Then, the fuse blows. And of course, it happens right when Ralph and his mom bring up Ralph's dad. Because if anything indicates that Old Man Parker's spirit is still with them, it's a fuse blowing under a Christmas tree.
And right when it seemed the only thing missing was the old man, he was here, just like always.
When we think of The Simpsons holiday episodes, our thoughts immediately turn to Halloween due to the wildly successful Treehouse of Horror stories. However, Springfield's favorite family has starred in plenty of Christmas adventures. In fact, here are 15 of them, ranked from worst to best according to fans on IMDb. Aired in December 2006, Kill Gil Volumes 1 and 2 finds The Simpsons taking pity on Springfield's eternally down-on-his-luck businessman, Gil. They even invite him to stay at their home for Christmas. Unfortunately, Marge has a hard time saying no, and Gil ends up crashing at their place for 11 months. They're a hilarious 11 months to be sure, but they push Marge and the family to the edge. By the time Marge finally works up the gumption to kick Gil out, she discovers that he just left on his own. However, with the need for closure, the family drives all the way to Arizona so Marge can tell Gil exactly how she feels. Like most Simpsons episodes, this one is packed with great lines, but there's one that stands above the rest.
Why did you let that loser into our home?
I'll tell you why. Christian charity.
Christian charity? What does a porn star have to do with this?
In the episode White Christmas Blues, climate change has made it far too hot for snow to fall throughout the vast majority of America, except for Springfield. As it turns out, pollution from the town's nuclear power plant combines with smoke from its perpetually burning tire yard to create freak conditions allowing for snow. So, an influx of tourists dash into Springfield to experience a traditional white Christmas. The town becomes so overrun that hotels are turning people away. In need of holiday money, Marge decides to take in some boarders despite Homer's objections.
No way. I'm not sharing my bed with anybody except you. And maybe that guy, Lincoln style. But that's it.
Eventually, the guests become so rude and demanding that they nearly destroy The Simpsons' holiday spirit. But we all know that Marge would never let that happen. The fight before Christmas would go down as a pretty standard Simpsons holiday episode, were it not for the final of its 4 Christmas-themed segments. To wrap the episode up, The Simpsons switches its format from animation to puppetry, and the cast turns into full-on felt and stuffing Muppets. This sudden switch was pretty stunning to some fans, but the show had yet another surprise lined up. After being edited out of a Sesame Street episode for dressing in a way that some people considered too risque for a children's show, Katy Perry drops by The Simpsons holiday special for a live-action celebrity cameo. Unfortunately, even that wasn't enough to impress some viewers.
Last night, I had a visit from 3 spirits.
I wish this show had a visit from 3 new writers.
Penned by OG Simpsons writer and longtime showrunner Al Jean, I Won't Be Home for Christmas finds Marge enraged when Homer stays out late on Christmas Eve. However, Homer only gets held up because Moe needs some company to help him through an extra difficult spell of holiday-related loneliness. This season 26 episode makes plenty of gestures toward emphasizing the importance of family and togetherness and all that, but without any genuine conflict, the story glides through your brain without leaving much to remember it by. Although in one scene, Homer stumbles across Gil in a movie theater, which raises the question, why is Gil in so many Simpsons holiday episodes? We're not even in the top 10 yet, and he's already popped up twice. Once again, Gil manages to find his way into yet another Simpsons Christmas special. In 'Tis the 30th Season, Marge rescues Gil from being trampled at a Black Friday sale and helps him secure a plush toy for his grandchild. Later in the episode, Homer and the kids decide to give Marge a break for the holidays, and the family heads to Florida. The only problem is that Homer books them a room in a seriously dingy motel. Plus, the nearby theme park isn't any better with its shabby Hall of Vice Presidents and assortment of bizarre cartoon character mascots. 'Tis the 30th Season also marks another instance of the show's writers parodying the famous horsehead scene from The Godfather.
I shot my best friend in the face.
Simpsons Christmas Story stands as the second anthology episode on this list and includes 3 holiday tales. The middle story is the real standout here and focuses on Grandpa reminiscing to Bart and Lisa about why he wants to kill Santa Claus. Without giving too much away, this 2005 episode features the first and last appearance of Great Uncle Cyrus Simpson, who lives in Tahiti with his 15 wives and presumably several Simpsons cousins and second cousins. It also boasts an amazing flashback sequence of a young Grandpa and Mr. Burns marooned on an island where Santa and his reindeer find themselves in some dangerous situations.
I'm just missing Prancer and Rudolph.
In 'Tis the 15th Season, Homer demonstrates ample selfishness by buying an expensive gizmo for himself, severely limiting the rest of the family's Christmas budget. After watching a Mr. Magoo-inspired cartoon that mimics A Christmas Carol, Homer decides to be the most charitable person in town, instead of a selfish oaf. This development enrages Ned Flanders, because being charitable is his trademark. Later in the episode, Homer pulls a Grinch Who Stole Christmas because Lisa tells him everyone would be happier if society was a little less materialistic. As a whole, 'Tis the 15th Season demonstrates how television writers can copy and paste pre-existing pop culture and explain that their intent was satire or homage as opposed to exploring new ideas. When Homer tells his family about the cartoon he watched, Lisa explains to him that the storyline is nothing new.
Dad, what you saw was A Christmas Carol. It was written by Charles Dickens 160 years ago. Yeah, TV writers have been milking that goat for years.
After Mr. Burns pays for repairs at Reverend Lovejoy's church during Season 13's She of Little Faith, the heartless miser insists that the place of worship be covered in advertising. Upset by the feckless capitalism and trivialized spirituality, Lisa converts to Buddhism with a little help from guest star Richard Gere. Once again, The Simpsons stumbles into the paradox that has sunk other episodes. It wants to use religion for comedic purposes, but runs up against an imperative to never suggest that mainstream religion is funny. Luckily, this episode doesn't feel like a cop-out.
Go! Ooh, you'll get yours.
During the story's second half, Marge's campaign to lure Lisa back into the flock gets so manipulative that even Homer gives her an incredulous glance, making this a rare Simpsons episode in which Homer plays the voice of reason. In Season 11's Grift of the Magi, Kid First Industries bails out Springfield Elementary, and much like the narrative of She of Little Faith, commercialization runs totally amok. Quite unlike She of Little Faith, this episode features a celebrity cameo from Gary Coleman that feels inspired and purposeful in contrast to Richard Gere's walk-on. It's hard to say how many members of the television viewing public under 40 years old have ever seen Different Strokes, but even if younger fans don't recognize Coleman, plenty of viewers know that he delivered one of the best Simpsons cameos ever.
I'm sorry, Gary, there's no longer a place for you here.
What you talking about, Miss Nagel?
That is so adorable! You're rehired.
The Way of the Dog is a 2020 episode that finds Santa's little helper losing control of his unresolved emotional issues, which leads him to getting a little bitey with Marge. A dog behaviorist voiced by Cate Blanchett figures out that his problems are related to trauma from when he was a puppy. So the Simpsons track down a dog trainer who proudly admits to separating their pooch from his mother. Of course, the family has a perfectly natural reaction to this news.
Ow.
The episode ends with the Simpsons bringing home Santa's little helper's mother, the perfectly named She-Biscuit. Bart accidentally melts the family's plastic Christmas tree and destroys all of their presents in the episode Miracle on Evergreen Terrace. Being Bart, he blames the whole fiasco on an imaginary burglar. After a news report airs about the supposed break-in, the residents of Springfield rally together to give the Simpsons a Merry Christmas. When the truth eventually comes out, there's an understandable backlash against the family. The final few minutes in which the town righteously loots 742 Evergreen Terrace are easily the funniest few of the entire episode.
You're heading for the medicine cabinet. I already been there.
In Skinner's Sense of Snow, a blizzard traps Bart, Lisa, and plenty of other students at Springfield Elementary during the final day before winter break. Most of the jokes in the episode revolve around Principal Skinner's futile attempt to maintain order. Eventually, Skinner starts to lose his cool and takes his frustrations out on groundskeeper Willie.
That's the last time you'll slap your Willie around. I quit.
There are also a few apparent lapses of in-story logic here, and not necessarily the kind we can wave off just because it's a cartoon. Lisa revels in anti-establishment chaos in a manner that clashes with the highly respectful attitude toward the education system she usually displays. Plus, Skinner spends much of the episode's second half stuck in a dodgeball bag that doesn't seem like it should be able to bind an adult human. Speaking of Skinner's adulthood, this episode aired in 2000 and states his age as 40, but in a flashback it also depicts him as an adult soldier during the Vietnam War. For many fans, some of the most memorable Simpsons episodes and segments take place in the future. It's always fun to see how much Lisa has achieved and how little Bart has changed. The 2011 episode Holidays of Future Past is no exception. 30 years in the future, the Simpsons reunite to spend Christmas together. Along the way, we learn that Lisa is a successful businesswoman and, with her husband Milhouse, has an angsty teenage daughter. Bart, of course, is a down-and-out divorced dad. But the big surprise here is that Maggie is a world-famous rock star and she recently gave birth to her first child. The story also features ungrateful Simpson grandkids, dozens of adult Ralph Wiggum clones, and an unusually optimistic vision of Homer as an old man. But the emotional highlight of the episode occurs when Bart and Lisa have a few too many drinks in their old treehouse and Bart makes a confession to his overachieving sister.
Lisa, you're the person I always wanted to be.
The series premiere of the longest-running scripted television show in the history of the medium almost feels too historic to be contextualized as one of several specific Simpsons episodes. But then again, it is very much a Simpsons holiday special, even if it might also be other things of equal or greater significance. It took The Simpsons until roughly 8 episodes into its second season to really figure itself out and rise to the immaculate level we associate with the show. But Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire certainly contains hints of the absurdity, irreverence, self-awareness, and heart that was coming down the pipeline. Maybe hints is putting it too lightly. Homer's stint as a mall Santa is very absurd. Bart's dialogue is already very irreverent and self-aware, and the family's decision to give Santa's little helper a forever home, even though he failed to win them a dime at the racetrack, checks off the heart box for sure. Ironically, the top-ranking Simpsons holiday episode, according to fans, isn't really about Christmas. To put it more precisely, Marge Be Not Proud isn't addressing boilerplate, generalized themes about family or togetherness. Instead, it's the definitive Bart episode, with Christmas functioning as a plot device. In the story, the eldest Simpson child gets busted shoplifting a video game, and Marge responds as if it's the worst thing he's ever done. Sure, Bart caused an international incident as recently as the previous season, but in terms of the kind of non-fantastical mischief that a 10-year-old boy could commit in real life, ripping off the try and save is his greatest transgression. Bart puts actual effort into reestablishing the doting mother-son dynamic he rejects at the beginning of the episode when he claims he's not a little kid anymore. While he's happy to play the part of his generation's Dennis the Menace, he doesn't want his mayhem to go too far and alienate his family. Or, for that matter, his audience. Marge, Be Not Proud, established a rule The Simpsons has more or less followed since. Bart's shenanigans must remain either too cartoony for reality or too harmless for anyone to take seriously. His character walks that fine line and usually caps it off with one of his many catchphrases.
Eat my shorts.
Selfish elves, a Santa kidnapping, and a candy-fueled creeper. We love Elf, but there are a few things you won't be able to ignore next time you watch it. At its heart, Elf is a classic fish-out-of-water comedy, but with the added twist being that the fish, Buddy the Elf, doesn't fit in back in the water either. The movie's opening scenes show us some great physical comedy as the 6'3" Will Ferrell squeezes himself into elf-sized showers and beds. But here's the thing. Why don't the elves just, make him a bed? One of the things that makes the movie feel heartwarming and Christmassy is that the other elves up at Santa's workshop are generally pretty nice to Buddy. They even take time to reassure him that he's got his own special talents when he starts to feel like he doesn't fit in. And even if they get frustrated behind his back, it's clear that they care about him. So, why in the 30 years that he's been there, haven't they made the slightest adjustment to their housing situation so that he's not destroying his spine every night? It's not like it would take them that long. Building things is literally all the elves do, and a king-sized bed frame and mattress surely wouldn't take as much time to cobble together as, say, building a PlayStation 5 from scratch. He's not even the only one there who needs human-sized furniture, since Santa Claus also lives there and has been doing so for about 1,500 years. Even if the elves aren't the ones who made his furniture, just order another mattress and put it on the floor. It's not great, but it's better than sleeping with all your limbs hanging off the bed. The odd thing about Buddy the Elf is that he never seems to notice that he's roughly 3 times taller than everyone he knows. Well, almost everyone. The only exception is Santa Claus. Buddy's still taller than Santa, but not to the extent that it is with the other elves. If anything, Buddy should probably assume that he's a Santa, or at least some other kind of human. The only reason that Buddy thinks he's an elf at all is that after accidentally kidnapping him when Buddy was an infant, Santa pulls the very un-Santa-like move of keeping him and handing him off to the elves. This, by the way, is not what you should do if you ever find a baby. Buddy's naivete is at the core of the film, but there's a fine line between his earnest, good-natured belief that a random diner really did perfect the world's best cup of coffee and the kind of oblivious ignorance of just not being able to put simple clues together.
You did it! Congratulations! World's best cup of coffee. Great job, everybody!
You'd think that if you can figure out how to build 85 Etch-a-Sketches in a single day, you'd be a little bit better at putting things together.
Past the sea of swirly, twirly gumdrops, and then I walked through the Lincoln Tunnel.
This is going to sound pretty nitpicky for a movie where we're willing to accept that Santa Claus can fly around the world in a single night giving all the good children presents, but the fact that Buddy walks from the North Pole to Manhattan is a little ridiculous. There are a lot of reasons for that. Primarily the fact that it's a straight shot of about 3,400 miles from Santa's workshop to Manhattan. Even if we're willing to accept that the iceberg he floats off on takes him down to Canada, that still leaves him in the Nunavut with 2,900 miles left to go. We'll give you that his elf clothes are magical and able to keep him warm at the North Pole and below, but still. No matter how hyped up he is on maple syrup and candy canes, that's a long and potentially, or let's be real here, almost certainly fatal journey for someone who's completely unprepared for it. Now, here's why this isn't as much of a nitpick as it seems like. The scene sticks out because this is a movie with Santa in it. The guy has a magic flying sleigh that can cover 212 million miles in a single night. Sure, he's a busy guy around the holidays, but are we really meant to believe that Santa Claus can't take 0.4 seconds out of his day so that he doesn't have to deal with a singing penguin finding a dead body in the candy cane forest after the spring thaw?
You like sugar, huh?
Is there sugar in syrup?
Yes.
Then yes!
One of the biggest sources of comedy throughout Elf is Buddy's ridiculously candy-centric diet. After all, he hails from a land of Christmas cheer that was inspired by the Rankin Bass stop-motion specials of the 60s. So he grew up on a steady diet of candy canes and describes the North Pole's 4 food groups as
candy, candy canes,
candy corns, and syrup.
Of course, that means Buddy should be straight up dead. You probably figured this out for yourself in the days after Halloween when you were a kid, but a diet that consists entirely of candy isn't just unhealthy, it's also a great way to get type 2 diabetes. Sure, you could explain it away by saying that all the candy at the North Pole is suffused with Christmas magic that makes it delicious and nutritious. But after he comes to New York, Buddy keeps up his standard habits, drowning a plate of spaghetti with an entire bottle of maple syrup and washing it down by slamming an entire 2-liter bottle of Coca-Cola. In fact, the few things we see him eat in the movie that aren't candy are a bottle of booze and a jar full of cotton balls. Fun fact, in real life, those cotton balls were actually cotton candy. If you need any evidence that wolfing down that much sugar was a bad idea, look no further than Will Ferrell himself. In interviews about the film since its release, he's talked about how he lost sleep while the movie was being filmed thanks to the constant sugar intake. Multiply that by 30-plus years worth of sugar-coated meals, and you've got health problems that go way beyond a little insomnia, and into the territory of having your heart explode while chugging maple syrup.
Did you sleep okay last night?
Great! I got a full 40 minutes.
Just 5 years away from Iron Man, Jon Favreau was the man who directed Elf, and he even has a small part as the Hobbs family's friendly physician. He also provides the voice of the North Pole's resident narwhal.
Bye, buddy. Hope you find your dad.
And while we're talking about Favreau's doctor, we'd be remiss if we didn't cover what might be the worst medical decision ever committed to film. After performing a DNA test to confirm that, yes, Buddy is in fact Walter's biological son, the doctor advises Walter to take Buddy home to meet his wife and son in hopes that he'll eventually come to terms with the situation and drop the whole elf thing and move on. Obviously, that all works out for Buddy and the Hobbs family, but by any measure, this is some truly terrible advice. Both Walter and the doctor are operating under the assumption that Buddy is extremely delusional. Any medical professional worth a stethoscope would most likely suggest that they get Buddy some immediate treatment, psychiatric or otherwise, before his disconnect with reality leads to more violence. That's right, more violence. The scene with the blood test happens directly after Walter bails Buddy out of jail after he assaults a department store Santa at Gimbel's. In other words, the doctor is confronted with a delusional man with a very recent history of violence, and his solution to this problem is to take him home to your wife and kid. Here's hoping the first thing the Hobbs family does after the credits roll is get themselves a new general practitioner.
Your father, well, he's on the naughty list.
The driving conflict of Elf is that Walter Hobbs, Buddy's long-lost human father, has landed himself squarely on the naughty list. The reason? Well, in addition to just being a fairly unpleasant person, and all those murders he did in The Godfather, Walter has been neglecting his family and focusing too much on his work. This is the plot to plenty of Christmas movies about learning how to love your family more effectively under the boot heel of consumerism. But there's something different about Walter's story. He's genuinely terrible at his job. Normally, the person in this kind of plot who's obsessing over their work is at least successful in that arena, which makes it more effective when they have to choose what's really important. Walter's got plenty of money. That apartment at Central Park West doesn't come cheap, but as far as the work goes, he's hardly a success. His company's floundering, and their downturn is a direct result of decisions that he made, or rather, due to decisions that he didn't make. Despite filling the role of the workaholic who spends too much time at the office, Walter doesn't actually seem to care about anything that he's doing at work, to the point of approving a proof of a book that was missing 2 pages. Even the most inept employee would notice if he was initialing 2 gigantic blank pages, so the simple fact is that Walter just doesn't care. That raises a pretty grim question, though. If he's neglecting his family for work, but he's not actually doing any work, is he just sitting there, taking as much time away from his wife and son as he can so that he can stare off into space and contemplate oblivion? That is dark.
I like it. I like it.
The major drama at the climax of the film centers around whether Santa's sleigh is going to be able to fly without the engine that's been keeping it going all these years. See, without the engine, the sleigh has to rely entirely on the magic of Christmas cheer to power it around the world. And according to the Clausometer, there's just not enough Christmas spirit to do the job. But that doesn't make sense. This is a world where Santa Claus is 100% actually factually real. with a toy factory at the North Pole staffed by cheerful singing elves, a talking snowman, and everything that goes along with him. He brings presents to the good children all over the world, which means that there's no disillusionment or disappointment from kids who didn't get what they wanted on Christmas morning. We also know from the movie that getting a present does in fact increase your Christmas spirit, as Michael, Walter's other son, boosts the clausometer a little bit when he gets the skateboard he's always wanted. So if Santa and the elves have been doing their job, and as far as we know they have, then there should be more than enough Christmas spirit to go around just from that, let alone all the general feel-good sentiments of peace on earth, goodwill, hot chocolate, and so on. One of the things that makes Elf such a favorite around the holidays is that it's an almost relentlessly cheerful film without getting too sugary sweet, Buddy Spaghetti notwithstanding. In fact, the closest it gets to anything you'd call dark would be the depiction of the Santa-hating Central Park Rangers at the end. Oh, and that one part where Buddy commits felony assault on an innocent man for the crime of dressing up as Santa Claus. But even if Buddy's sudden temper is slightly out of character, that all makes perfect sense in the context of the movie. What happens after, however, seems like a stretch. Since the original Gimbel's Santa is no longer available, the toy department's manager has to fill in, and frankly, that's ridiculous. If you've ever been to Macy's around Christmas time, then you already know that these stores take their Santa setup very seriously. It's a lot more complicated than just one dude sitting on a big chair asking kids what they want for Christmas. The Gimbels we see in the movie might not be as dedicated to it as Macy's, of course. Historically, the real-life Gimbels was Macy's competitor until shutting down in 1987, with their rivalry cementing itself into Christmas movie history as a plot point in the original Miracle on 34th Street. Still, the idea that a store that big wouldn't have at least a couple of backup Santas is somehow more difficult to believe than the flying reindeer. Buddy's romance with Jovi, a young woman working as an elf at Gimbel's, played in a star-making turn by Zooey Deschanel, ends up being pretty sweet, but it has a rocky start. Most people don't wind up going on dates with strangers who sneak up on them in the shower, no matter how nice they are about your singing afterwards. Considering that Elf has a runtime of just over 90 minutes, it makes sense that things have to move pretty fast to get everything wrapped up by the time the credits roll. Still, Jovi's awfully quick to forgive Buddy for creeping up on her in the shower, especially since the next two interactions she has with him involve him beating up the guy playing Santa Claus and then telling her that his tongue swells up around her and asking if she wants to go eat food.
I feel really warm when I am around you.
The fact that she goes out with him at all, let alone ends up in happy elfin matrimony after it's all said and done, is, well, it's a Christmas miracle. The weirdest part of all of this might be one that Jovi would have no way of knowing, but that we in the audience can peg as what might be the only lie Buddy tells in the whole movie. When she asks if he was spying on her in the shower, he replies,
"I didn't know you were naked."
This seems plausible, given Buddy's naive nature. The thing is, he definitely knew she was in the shower, and we actually see Buddy showering in an elf-sized tub earlier in the movie. Of course, he did have his hat on at the time, so maybe elves are a rare class of never nudes.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I need you to be completely undressed.
I am completely undressed.
There are any number of ways to tell a child that they are adopted, though perhaps no worse way than for them to overhear it from two coworkers bad-mouthing their Etch-a-Sketch production output. Buddy learns the hard way that he's not an elf, and while you might reasonably expect him to come to that conclusion after a decade or two, it's also not unreasonable to expect Papa Elf and Santa to have had that conversation directly, saving Buddy a bundle of unnecessary trauma. Santa's judgment in regards to the whole Buddy situation becomes even more suspect, considering the fact that he's apparently had all the information needed to reunite Buddy with his father for years. It would be one thing if Buddy were simply an anonymous orphan who crawled into Santa's sack one year. In that case, it would make a certain amount of sense for Santa to take the human baby in and raise it at the North Pole. But Santa also knows the name of Buddy's mother, Susan Wells, the circumstances of her death, the name of his still living father, Walter Moss, Walter's job and the location of his office, and the fact that Walter is on the naughty list. He only reveals this information when his hand is forced, as Buddy inadvertently discovers the truth. While it's hard to hate on Santa Claus, all of this points to a serious lapse of judgment on the big guy's part. The scene featuring future Game of Thrones star Peter Dinklage as hotshot children's book author Miles Finch is cringe-inducing, but purposely so. Walter has bribed Miles to come into the office and help his clueless in-house writers with a new book pitch. He's hoping this pitch will be the thing that gets Walter back in good with his boss and save his job. But before Miles can get into his potential storyline, Buddy barges into the meeting and mistakes the man for an elf. Miles takes offense at Buddy's sincere excitement to see a fellow elf as a crack about his height. And while he tries to keep his cool, eventually Buddy's insults become too much to bear. Miles runs across the boardroom table and dropkicks him. That all makes sense, even if, in illustrating Buddy's insensitivity, the film itself gets a little insensitive. What doesn't make much sense is how no one else in this scene, not Walter, his writers, or his secretary, does anything to break up the fight, as Miles chokes Buddy to the ground and breaks every lighting fixture and piece of glassware in the room along the way. They all just sit there, apparently frozen in shock, until the scene ends with Walter angrily disowning Buddy. Every year, it seems that someone on the internet discovers and is newly horrified by the scene in which Buddy, banished to the Greenway Press mailroom for irritating Walter, makes friends with, and accidentally gets day drunk with, a worker played by Mark Atchison. As they recline on a pair of rolling carts full of padded envelopes, declaring themselves best friends, Mailroom Guy, as he is credited, laments the direction that his life is taken. He just goes with the flow, but now he needs to get out of the flow.
I'm 26 years old, I got nothing to show.
You're young. You're so young.
Atchison was in fact 46 years old when the film was released. And while he may appear relatively youthful for a 46-year-old, he makes for an alarmingly craggy, gravel-voiced 26-year-old. Mailroom Guy works in a chaotic processing room with no source of natural light. He drinks from a half pint of hard liquor on the job, and only has the job thanks to a prison work release program. So the impact of the gag makes for a worthy suspension of disbelief.